Hey friends, tonight we're stepping back into ancient Rome, somewhere most history books leave alone. So before you get comfortable, take a moment like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. There's something strangely calming about knowing others are listening to these same quiet stories at the same time, even from different places, in different nights of the world. So if you're still awake with me, you can simply settle in now. Let the lights soften a little, maybe let the room feel a bit heavier, a bit quieter. And let's ease into tonight's quiet hour together. Tonight, you are not in your bedroom anymore. You are somewhere older. The streets outside are stone and mud, and the smell of something you can't quite name. Someone nearby is already awake. They have been awake for hours. A lamp is burning in a window above you. The city around you is not quiet. It never was. Rome did not do quiet, but we are not starting in the grand places. Not the Forum, not the Senate steps, not the marble corridors where the famous men said the famous things. We are starting somewhere more honest than that. We are starting in the room everyone used and nobody discussed. Welcome to the Forica. You have been walking for 20 minutes through the early morning streets of Rome, a city of perhaps 1 million people in its peak centuries. Give or take the counting, which was always approximate and occasionally optimistic. You are tired, you are hungry, and you need to use the toilet, so you find one. It is not difficult. Public latrines, foricare, were distributed across the city with something approaching civic generosity. Some neighborhoods had several. A busy one might service 50 people at a time. You pay a small coin at the entrance, though in some districts the fee has been waived today, which you take as a sign that the city is in a charitable mood or the attendant is simply not here yet. You step inside. The room is stone. The bench running along the wall is stone. The holes cut into the bench at regular intervals, each one the width of a seated adult, each one spaced perhaps 2 feet from the next, are simply open. No partition, no screen, no curtain. The man to your left is a tradesman. The man to your right, you will discover from his conversation, is something closer to a municipal administrator. He is discussing a property dispute. He does not stop discussing it when you sit down. Beneath the bench, a channel of running water moves steadily away from you. This is genuinely impressive engineering. The water flows in, flows through, flows out, carrying everything with it toward the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer, which has been draining this city since the 6th century before the Common Era, and will continue to do so long after the empire has found more creative ways to embarrass itself. The Romans were proud of the Cloaca Maxima. Pliny the Elder described it in terms that suggested he had strong feelings about drainage infrastructure. He was not wrong to. For its time, and for several centuries after its time, it was an extraordinary thing. But that is not what you are looking at right now. You are looking at the object on the wall beside you. There is a small trough of liquid vinegar, usually, sometimes salt water, running along the front of the bench at knee height. And resting in it, handle extended toward you, is a terracotta stick with a sea sponge affixed to one end. You have seen this before. Every forica has one. There is one object in this room that everyone uses and nobody owns. You know what it is for. But there is something about how it works, the full mechanics of it, the specific logic behind the vinegar, the exact sequence of what happens before and after your hand touches the handle, that most accounts quietly skip over. We will come back to it. For now, the administrator to your right has resolved the property dispute to his apparent satisfaction. He reaches for the sponge stick. He uses it. He returns it to the trough. He stands, adjusts his toga with the practiced efficiency of a man who has been doing this in public for 40 years, and leaves without a word. You are next. The xylospongium, from the Greek, roughly, wood sponge, was the standard Roman hygiene tool for personal cleaning after toilet use. It appears in texts, it appears in archaeological contexts, it appears in graffiti. It was not a secret. It was not considered remarkable. It was simply the thing you used, the way you use what you use now, except that what you use now is not shared with 50 strangers in a rotating schedule across a 12-hour day. The sponge was sea sponge, real sea sponge, harvested from the Mediterranean, cut and shaped and attached to a stick of wood or terracotta, roughly the length of your forearm. The handle gave you reach. The sponge did the work. The trough of vinegar or salt water was the rinsing mechanism, the closest thing the Roman public latrine had to a cleaning protocol. Here is what the protocol actually looked like. You used the sponge, you rinsed it in the trough, you returned it to the trough. The next person used it. The vinegar was not decorative. Vinegar has genuine antimicrobial properties. It will kill a reasonable range of bacteria given sufficient contact time and concentration. Roman physicians knew that sour wine and vinegar had cleaning properties. They used them on wounds. They used them in medical contexts. The choice of vinegar for the forica trough was not arbitrary. It was within the framework of what Romans understood about disease and contamination. A considered decision. Whether it was sufficient is a different question. The concentration varied. The contact time varied. The number of users between rinsings varied enormously. A busy forica at midday in a crowded district might see 30 or 40 people cycle through a single sponge stick in an hour. The vinegar trough did not change between users. It accumulated. By late afternoon, a busy forica's trough was doing something, but the medical community of the 21st century would have notes. A specific detail worth holding: in some foricare there were multiple sponge sticks, 2, sometimes 3, on busy benches. This was considered a premium amenity. Records suggest some patrons had preferences. The smell in the room was, by all available accounts, significant. Seneca, writing from an apartment above a bathhouse, complained bitterly about noise. He did not, in that particular letter, address the forica. He had other complaints. But Martial, the poet, the one who wrote about everything in Rome with the cheerful specificity of a man who had decided embarrassment was for other people, mentioned the forica smell directly and with what reads in Latin as fond resignation. It was part of the city. It was the city working. You breathe through your mouth. You do not think about it too hard. 50 years from now, if you live that long, you will not remember the smell. You will remember the conversation with the administrator. Romans were social in the forica in a way that strikes the modern imagination as deeply, specifically wrong, and that wrongness is the point. The wrongness is the gap between their ordinary and yours. Now the sponge stick, the full mechanics. The vinegar was changed, sometimes daily, sometimes not. The sponge itself was rinsed, not replaced. There was no protocol for replacing the sponge. In a well-run forica, an attendant managed the trough, kept the water flowing beneath the bench, collected the entry coins, and maintained a general sense of order. In a poorly run forica, and there were poorly run foricare as there are poorly run versions of everything, the trough was changed when someone complained, which was occasionally never. Some foricare had their own attendants, sponges, better quality, reserved for regular patrons who tipped. This was, in the Roman economy of small dignities, a meaningful distinction, cloaking the whole arrangement, and this is the detail that keeps appearing in accounts without much commentary, as if the writers themselves weren't sure how to frame it, was the goddess Closina. She presided over the sewers, and, by extension, the latrines. She received real offerings. Small shrines to Closina existed near major foricare. A Roman, going to the public toilet, it might, on the way in, murmur a quiet word to Closina, not because they were unusually pious, but because you covered your bases. You thanked the gods for the things that worked. The sewers worked. The water flowed. The sponge was there when you needed it. It was not glamorous. It was not meant to be. It was infrastructure, and here is the part that really lands if you let it settle. The Romans understood contamination imperfectly, partially, but genuinely. Their physicians wrote about the dangers of bad water. Vitruvius, designing buildings, considered the health implications of drainage. The vinegar was not superstition. It was applied knowledge, imprecise but intentional. What they did not have, could not have in 100 C, was the germ theory of disease. They knew that certain smells meant danger. They knew that certain conditions produced illness. They did not know why. And so they did the reasonable thing. They applied what they knew. They trusted the infrastructure they had built. They gave a quiet nod to Closina on the way in, and they sat down next to the municipal administrator and let the water run beneath them. Disease wasn't tragic. It was Tuesday, and the sponge was there when you needed it. And if the latrine tells you anything about Rome, it's this. The Romans were not embarrassed by the body, but they were terrified of one particular smell, the smell of a body that had gone wrong, that had stopped performing correctly, that had begun to broadcast its failures outward. That fear shaped almost everything they put on their faces and their skin. And some of what they put there was considerably worse than anything in the Foraca trough. Welcome to the Roman morning. Specifically, welcome to the hour before anyone important is seen. The city is already moving. It was moving before dawn, because Rome did not permit carts inside the walls during daylight hours, which meant the nights were loud with wheels and the mornings were loud with everything else. But in the upper floors of the insulae, in the private rooms of the domus, in the dim space behind the curtain, where the lady of the house is already sitting upright on a low stool in that room. The day has its own rhythm. It begins with the face, not with breakfast, not with prayer, though prayer will come. With the face, because the face in Rome was a document. It told people who you were, what you owned, how seriously you took the performance of being yourself in public. A Roman woman of means did not walk into the street unconsidered. She walked in constructed. And the construction took time, sometimes an hour, sometimes considerably more, and involved a set of materials that were, depending on your century, your social position, and your access to the right traders, either quietly dangerous or immediately dangerous. You are sitting on the stool. The light is low. Someone is standing behind you with a small pot and a spatula, and what is in that pot is the first problem of the morning. The foundation of the Roman face was cerussa, white lead. Lead carbonate, to be precise, produced by exposing lead sheets to the vapor of vinegar over several weeks, scraping off the resulting white crust, grinding it, mixing it with water or animal fat into a smooth paste. The process was known. The result was consistent. The color was excellent, a cool, bright white that covered redness, even the skin tone, filled in the small imperfections that Roman beauty standards, which were specific and demanding, and fully in writing, deemed unacceptable. It was applied to the face, to the neck, to the upper chest. Daily, by women across the social spectrum, from the wealthiest matron to the working woman who could afford the cheaper grade. Some men used it. Stage performers used it heavily. Cerussa was not niche. It was the baseline. Lead is a neurotoxin. It accumulates. The body does not excrete it efficiently. It stores it in the bones, in the soft tissue, building over years of daily application into a concentration that modern forensic analysis of Roman skeletal remains has found to be, in some cases, 10 to 100 times what we now consider safe background exposure. Roman physicians noted that lead, when ingested in quantity, caused problems. Nicander of Colophon, writing in the 2nd century before the Common Era, described lead poisoning with uncomfortable accuracy: the pale skin, the weakness of the limbs, the failing eyesight, slow collapse of the digestive system. He was describing the symptoms. He was not connecting them to the pot on the dressing table. Nobody did, not in any text that survives. The Cerasa sat on the table each morning. The cosmeti, the enslaved women whose specific role was the application of cosmetics, picked up the spatula. And the day began. There is one ingredient in the standard Roman beauty kit that was considered deeply ordinary, imported at significant expense, and would today result in the entire supply chain being dismantled by several overlapping regulatory bodies. It was not the Cerasa. The Cerasa was dangerous. This ingredient was something else, something that required a specific animal, a specific climate, and a specific willingness to set aside a very natural human reaction to what you were being asked to apply to your face. We will come back to it. Beyond the foundation, the Roman face had layers. Coal for the eyes, antimony sulfide, ground fine, applied to the lids and the waterline with a small stick. Antimony is mildly toxic, with repeated exposure. Roman women knew it caused irritation. The texts say so directly. Writers note the redness, the weeping, the occasional swelling that came from daily coal application. The solution in Roman dermatological advice was to use slightly less, or to take a day off on alternating weeks, or to mix the antimony with something soothing. Egg white was popular. To reduce the sting, nobody suggested stopping. The eyebrows were managed separately, plucked, shaped, sometimes darkened with soot, or with a preparation made from burnt cork. A single continuous brow, the monobrow, was considered attractive by some writers and actively cultivated by some women, which is one of those details Roman history produces occasionally to remind you that beauty is entirely a conversation a culture has with itself, and the conversation changes. Rouge came from several sources. Red ochre, ground and mixed with fat. The lees of red wine, dried and powdered. In some preparations, vermilion, which is mercuric sulfide, and which is also toxic, and which produced a very reliable red that the alternatives struggled to match. The cheeks, the lips, sometimes a faint flush applied to the forehead. The goal was color that read as health, the warmth of a body that was fed and rested and not currently dying of anything. The irony that some of the materials used to suggest health were quietly producing the opposite was not, apparently, a theme anyone examined closely. The teeth came last, or sometimes first, depending on the household. Tooth powder was standard ground pumice mixed with various additions, applied with a cloth or a small brush made from frayed wood. The Romans had strong feelings about teeth. Bad teeth were social failure. Catullus, the poet, wrote several epigrams about bad teeth that were not gentle. The tooth powder helped within limits. What also helped, and this is where the morning routine reaches one of its more arresting moments, was urine. Fermented urine, collected, aged for several days until the ammonia content rose to a useful level, then used as a mouthwash or a tooth whitening rinse. The ammonia in fermented urine genuinely whitens teeth. This is chemistry, not superstition. The Romans knew it worked because they could observe that it worked. They did not know why. They did not need to. It worked, it was available, it was cheap, and the Roman relationship with bodily fluids was, across the board, considerably less squeamish than the modern one. Urine also appeared as a skin toner, applied to the face after the cerasa, blotted gently, left briefly. The ammonia, again, mild exfoliation, slight brightening. The smell was managed with perfume, which was applied after in quantity. Urine was, in the Roman economy of the body, a resource. It was collected from public foricare in large vats by fullers, the laundry workers, who used it to clean wool. It was taxed under Vespasian, which produced his famous remark that money did not smell, which was technically correct and completely beside the point. It moved through the Roman economy with the unselfconscious efficiency of something everyone needed, and no one thought twice about. And here is the part most history books quietly leave out about the morning dressing room. The cosmetee who applied all of this, the white lead foundation, the kohl, the rouge, the urine toner, perfume, were enslaved. They were skilled. The role required training, steadiness, an eye for proportion, and the ability to read the mood of the woman on the stool and act accordingly. They worked with expensive materials. They were responsible for a result that would be judged in public. And if the result displeased, if the foundation was uneven, if the kohl smeared, if the color was wrong, the consequences for the cosmetee were not abstract. Roman law and Roman custom gave the mistress of the household extensive latitude in how she expressed her dissatisfaction. Some mistresses were fair, some were not. Juvenal, the satirist, described a scene in enough detail that it reads less like exaggeration and more like testimony. The cosmetee did not get to have opinions about the urine toner, the imported ingredient, the one that required a specific animal. Here it is, crocodile dung, specifically crocodile excrement, dried, ground, and mixed with a preparation used as a face mask and skin brightener. This appears in Galen. Galen, the most influential physician of the Roman world, whose texts were copied and consulted for over 1,000 years after his death, mentioned crocodile dung preparations in the context of skin treatment without particular alarm. He was not the only one. The ingredient appears in enough sources to rule out isolated eccentricity. It was imported, presumably from Egypt, at a cost that would have placed it beyond ordinary means, but within reach of the genuinely wealthy. It was considered efficacious. The reasoning was humoral. The specific properties of the substance in the Roman medical framework were believed to interact with the skin in beneficial ways. Whether it worked by any mechanism other than the drying and mild abrasive effect of finely ground powder applied to the face is not something modern dermatology has rushed to investigate. But it was there, on the dressing table, next to the white lead and the kohl and the small pot of ammonia. Aged urine. Every morning, perfectly ordinary. Beauty in Rome was not vanity, or rather, it was vanity, but vanity was a duty. A Roman woman who appeared in public unpresented was failing a social obligation. Too much cosmetic was a different failure. It mocked you as theatrical, untrustworthy, possibly Greek in the wrong sense. The ideal was controlled, deliberate, legible. You were supposed to look like you had made an effort without looking like the effort had been enormous. The effort was always enormous. It was just supposed to be invisible. And the cosmetee who made it invisible, who managed the white lead and the crocodile dung and the fermented urine with the steadiness of professionals who had been doing this since they were trained into the role at 12 or 13 years old. Those women are in almost none of the histories. They were in the room every morning. They are in almost none of the histories. It was beauty. It was performance. It was a very Roman solution. But the Romans didn't just decorate the face. They had opinions, very specific, very detailed, almost argumentative opinions about the smell of the body beneath the face. And those opinions led them to practices that were, depending on which account you read, either surprisingly sophisticated or quietly horrifying, and in several cases both at once. The instrument at the center of those practices was a small curved blade, and what Romans did with it, and what they did with what it removed, is something we should probably address directly. Welcome to the oil economy of the Roman body. It is mid-morning now. The face has been constructed. The toga, or the stola, depending on who you are and what you owe to public presentation today, has been arranged by someone else's hands, because arranging a toga correctly requires either a second person or a decade of practice, and most Romans with means chose the second person. You are dressed. You are presented. You are about to go out into a city of 1 million people in a climate that runs warm for most of the year, wearing several layers of wool. The smell question is not hypothetical. Rome had a position on this. Rome had a position on almost everything involving the body. The body was a civic matter, a moral matter, a matter of considerable literary interest, and the position on smell was more nuanced than you might expect and considerably stranger in its practical applications. The Romans did not simply tolerate body odor. They did not simply mask it. They had a system. The system involved a blade, a bowl, olive oil, and a secondary market that should not exist but did. You are going to the bathhouse, not because you are dirty exactly, because this is what you do. This is what everyone does. And the bathhouse is not, as it turns out, primarily about water. The strigil was a curved metal tool, iron, bronze, sometimes silver for the wealthy, shaped roughly like a long, shallow hook. The blade was not sharp. It did not need to be. Its purpose was not cutting. Its purpose was scraping. Here is the sequence of events. You arrive at the bathhouse. You hand your clothes to the capsarius, the slave assigned to watch them, because theft at Roman bathhouses was so common that leaving your clothes unattended was considered an act of remarkable optimism. You enter the unctuarium, the oiling room. An attendant or a slave you have brought yourself, if you are wealthy enough to have a personal body slave, applies olive oil to your skin. Not a small amount, a deliberate coating, arms, legs, back, chest, wherever the toga has been and wherever the sun will reach. The oil sits on the skin. You move around. You exercise if the bathhouse has a palaestra, a courtyard for that purpose. You sweat. The sweat mixes with the oil. The oil mixes with whatever has accumulated on the skin since the last time you went through this process. Then the strigil comes out. The attendant draws it across your skin in long, firm strokes, following the contour of the muscle, working from shoulder to wrist, from hip to knee. The blade collects what is on the skin: the oil, the sweat, the dead cells, the dirt from the street, the soot from the lamps, whatever the toga pressed against you during the morning's business. It collects all of it into a gray, brown paste that runs along the curved blade and drips, if you are not careful, onto the floor. This is Roman bathing. The water comes later, the warm room, the hot room, the cold plunge, but the actual cleaning mechanism, the thing doing the work of removing what accumulated on the body, is the strigil. Not soap. Rome had soap. They encountered it. They knew what it was. Some texts mention it in passing. But soap was not the Roman default. The strigil was the Roman default for centuries. In one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations the ancient world produced, the primary hygiene tool was a metal scraper and a bowl of olive oil. And what came off? The blade had a second life. Asterisk, loop a, planted asterisk, there is a byproduct of the Roman bathhouse that was collected in jars, sold at market, and considered so valuable that records indicate it was exported. It has a name. The name is oddly pleasant for what it describes. We will come back to the jars. The mechanics of the strigil pass require more specificity than they usually get. A professional scraping by a trained bath slave rather than a friend or a self-application took perhaps 20 minutes for a full body. It required knowledge of anatomy in a practical sense, which direction to draw the blade across which muscle group, how much pressure to apply to the back versus the inner arm versus the more sensitive regions. The toga did not protect from the sun. Bath slaves who were skilled at this were valued. Some were hired out. Some bathhouses advertised the quality of their scraping staff the way a modern establishment might advertise the quality of its facilities. The strigil itself was personal equipment. You brought your own. A good strigil was a possession with some status. They were given as gifts, inscribed with names, occasionally buried with their owners. Archaeological sites across the Roman world have produced them in quantity. Some are plain iron. Some are bronze with decorative handles. A silver strigil, found in a wealthy grave in Roman Britain, has an inscription that translates, roughly, as a name and the word mine, which is either touching or entirely on brand for Roman property culture, depending on your perspective. The oil used was olive oil of varying grades. The best oil, first cold press, the kind used in cooking and in lamps, was for wealthy patrons and their personal slaves. The oil used in the unctuarium of a public bathhouse for general admission was a lower grade, edible, technically, but not something you would use if you had a choice. It was oil. It did the job. It lifted the surface grime when the strigil came through, and it left the skin with a faint sheen that Romans associated with health and cleanliness. Which brings us to the armpit. Roman attitudes toward body hair were a class conversation conducted entirely in public and without apparent self-consciousness. Upper-class Romans, men and women both, depilated. The methods varied. Pumice stone, which abrared the hair away and took some skin with it. A resin preparation not unlike modern waxing, applied warm and pulled. Tweezers used individually, one hair at a time, which suggests either a very high pain tolerance or a very specific idea of what free time was for. Pliny the Elder noted depilation practices. Martial wrote about them. Ovid, in his advice to women on the presentation of the body, mentioned underarm hair with the brisk disapproval of a man who had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. A laborer's underarms were nobody's business. A senator's were a social statement. The smell politics of all this were explicit. Roman writers described the smell of upper-class men who did not depilate with a directness that leaves nothing to interpretation. Horace mentioned it. Catullus mentioned it. The smell of the unmanaged armpit was not considered merely unfortunate. It was considered evidence of character failure, of insufficient attention to the obligations of public life. You owed the people around you a body that had been managed. Perfume, in this framework, was not luxury. It was armor. And here is the part that really changes the picture. Roman perfume was not what the word suggests to a modern nose. It was not a light spritz applied at the wrist. Roman perfumery was heavy, oil-based, ricinus, Syrian rose, balsam, cinnamon, nard, myrrh, saffron, applied in quantity and in specific locations with specific social meaning. Different scents for different occasions, different concentrations for indoors versus the street. Some scents were gendered. Some were associated with particular cities, particular trades, particular social registers. The feet received perfume. This is not a detail most histories lead with, but Roman sources are specific about it. The soles of the feet scented. The hair received oil and sent a separate preparation from the body oil, applied after the bathhouse visit, worked through with a comb. The wrists received perfume, the neck. The toga itself could be stored with scented preparations to carry a faint background note into the day. A wealthy Roman walking into a dinner party was a layered olfactory experience. The base note of the olive oil still faint on the skin. The middle note of the nard or the rose in the hair. The top note of whatever the toga had absorbed in the cedar, wood storage box. The combination was deliberate. It was composed. Roman perfumers, unguentarii, ran serious businesses, imported rare ingredients across thousands of miles of sea and land trade route, and sold to a market that considered their product as essential as the strigil and the cerussa and the coal, and all of that, the oil, the scraping, the depilation, the perfume, for the poor, was unavailable. Or available in cheaper versions, tallow instead of olive oil, wood ash instead of pumice, no perfume, or a single cheap preparation applied in small amounts. The smell of the city's laboring population was a different smell from the smell of its senatorial class. Roman writers noted this. Roman writers always noted it. The distinction between the smell of a man who could afford the bathhouse daily and the smell of a man who could not was a social fact, discussed openly, mapped onto every other social distinction. The city maintained *loop a paid-off the jars. Back to the jars. The gray-brown paste that accumulated on the strigil blade. Oil, sweat, skin cells, street grime was not discarded. Outside a busy bathhouse, particularly near the exercise courts, collectors waited with ceramic jars. They purchased the scrapings. The product had a name, gloios, and gloios had a medical market. Roman physicians prescribed gloios for joint pain, for bruising, for skin conditions. The logic was humoral, the concentrated essence of an exercised body. The heat and effort pressed into oil, and the practice was not fringe. Galen mentioned it. Other physicians mentioned it. Athletes' gloios was considered particularly potent and commanded a higher price, because of course it did. A star athlete's sweat and oil scraping was worth more than a senator's. The market made its distinctions. If you had purchased gloios at a market stall in 1st century Rome, you would have had no reason to feel strange about it. It was medicine, it was trade, it was a very Roman solution. The body in Rome was not private. It was a public document, managed and presented and maintained with the seriousness of a legal obligation. The smell you projected told people your class, your discipline, your relationship to the civic body that contained you. The strigil was the instrument of that maintenance. The oil was the medium. The gloios was the byproduct. It was hygiene. It was economics. It was Tuesday, the bathhouse, though the bathhouse deserves its own accounting, because what happened inside those walls was not simply cleaning. It was something far more complicated and far less sanitary than the marble suggests. The water was warm, the water was shared, and by the 6th hour of the day, the water was something you would not choose to look at directly in good light. Welcome to the thermi at the 6th hour. This is not the thermi of the morning. The morning thermi was orderly, relatively speaking, which in Rome means that the violence was mostly verbal, and the thefts were mostly opportunistic rather than organized. The morning crowd was the early crowd, the men who had business to conduct, the women who had schedules, the elderly who slept badly and arrived at dawn because there was nowhere else to be, and the water was at least warm. By the 6th hour, the 6th hour being roughly what we would call noon, the character of the place has shifted. The admission fee for a public bath was minimal, a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin in circulation, worth approximately nothing in any transaction larger than this one. Children were sometimes free. Women paid the same as men, or more, depending on the establishment, and the emperor currently expressing opinions about mixed bathing. The fee was low by design. The bathhouse was infrastructure the way the aqueduct was infrastructure. It was a thing the city provided because a city of 1 million people in a warm climate required somewhere for those people to go, and the alternative was considerably worse for everyone. So they came. Everyone came. The fishmonger and the senator and the freedman and the slave whose owner had given him the afternoon. The woman who had been in the weaving room since before dawn. The soldier on leave. The student. The man whose occupation you cannot quite determine from his clothing, which is the point. They all came to the same water, and the water did not change between them. The thermi, the great imperial baths, at their height, were not simply bathhouses. They were cities inside the city. The baths of Caracalla, completed in 216 CE, could accommodate 1,600 bathers at a time across a complex that included libraries, gardens, exercise courts, shops, and lecture spaces. The baths of Diocletian were larger still. These were not places you went to get clean and leave. These were places you went to spend the afternoon, which meant the afternoon happened in, around, and occasionally underwater. The water itself moved through a sequence of rooms, the frigidarium, cold, a large pool, unheated, fed by aqueduct water at whatever temperature the aqueduct delivered. This was the reset. You came here after the heat, after the sweat. and the cold water closed the pores and cleared the head and produced, by all accounts, a physical sensation that Roman writers described with the specific enthusiasm of people who had found something that reliably worked. The tepidarium, warm, a transitional room, heated by the hypocaust system beneath the floor, a Roman engineering achievement that forced hot air through channels under the tile, warming the room from below. The tepidarium was where you lingered, where conversations happened, where the social business of the bathhouse was conducted. The caldarium, hot. The steam room, essentially moist heat, the water in the pool as hot as the furnaces beneath could make it, the air thick and close. This is where the strigal work happened, or continued, or was finished. The heat loosened everything. The oil ran more freely. The scraping was more thorough. The sudatorium in some establishments. Hotter still. A dry heat room, sometimes compared to what we would now recognize as a sauna. Not all thermi had one. The ones that did were considered premium. This is the design. This is the theory. Seneca wrote one letter about his experience living above a bathhouse, the noise, the grunting of the weight, lifters, the crack of the massage, the splash of the man who always entered the pool, with unnecessary drama that gets quoted often in histories of Roman daily life. There is one passage in it that most accounts skip. We will get to that passage, but first, the water itself and what was in it by the time you arrived at the 6th hour. The pools were not drained between bathers. This is the foundational fact that everything else builds on. A Roman bathhouse pool was filled at the start of the day, from the aqueduct through the heating system into the pool, and that water remained for the duration of operating hours. In a small neighborhood bathhouse, operating hours might run from late morning to sunset, perhaps 8 hours. In a larger thermi, longer. The water was not circulating in the modern sense. It was not filtered. There was no chlorine, no chemical treatment, no mechanical process separating what went into the pool from what came out of it. What went into the pool was 1,600 Romans in various states of cleanliness, having completed varying amounts of exercise, having applied and partially scraped off varying quantities of olive oil arriving from streets that were, by the standards of any era, significantly unsanitary. What came out of the pool at the end of the day required a drainage system the Romans had the engineering sense to make efficient. The oil from the strigal process did not fully leave the body before the patron entered the water. Some remained. Multiply this by the number of patrons. The caldarium pool, by midday, had a visible surface film that Roman writers mentioned with varying degrees of concern, mostly not much concern, because this was the water, this was the bathhouse. This was the infrastructure you had, and the alternative was the Tiber, which was worse. Food vendors operated inside the thermi. This detail appears in sources without much commentary. The way details appear when the people recording them cannot imagine why you would find them remarkable. You could purchase sausages in the bathhouse, bread, wine. The vendors moved through the rooms, sometimes stationary at small stalls near the entrance, sometimes circulating. Eating happened near the pools. Crumbs happened near the pools. Dropped food happened near the pools. The pools also received, on a not infrequent basis, the contents of patrons who had overestimated their self-control or underestimated the effect of the warm water on the body's willingness to cooperate. Roman sources mention this. They mention it the way you mention weather, as a condition, not an outrage. There were rules, signs, in some bathhouses, explicitly prohibiting certain behaviors in the pools. Fines, theoretically. Attendants, practically the bath slaves who managed the rooms, maintained the fires, replenished the oil, and were presumably responsible for responding to situations that required immediate practical intervention. Whether the enforcement was consistent is a question. The records answer mostly by not answering. By the 6th hour, in a busy thermi, the tepidarium pool was warm and opaque. The caldarium pool was hot and fragrant in a specific way. The frigidarium pool was cold, which helped, and also received everything that the warmer rooms had produced, which did not. The men and women who could afford private bathing facilities, the truly wealthy, the imperial household, the senatorial elite with large enough domus to install a private bath, did not use public thermi for actual hygiene. They used them for socializing. The cleaning happened at home, with private water and private slaves and private strigils, and a pool that had been filled that morning for one person's use. For everyone else, the thermi was both the social space and the hygiene infrastructure. There was no alternative. You got in, you stayed the expected amount of time, you conducted your business and your conversations and your exercise and your meal, and then you left, and the question of whether you were cleaner than when you arrived was one that Roman daily life did not put to the test too rigorously. Seneca's letter, the passage that gets omitted. He was writing to Lucilius about the difficulty of philosophical concentration in a noisy environment. The letter is famous for the inventory of sounds, the weight, lifters, the ball, players, the man who likes to hear his own voice echo in the vaulted ceiling. What gets quoted less is the moment near the end of the relevant passage where Seneca, having catalogued the noise, pivots briefly to the water and notes, with the flat precision of a man who has thought about this more than he wanted to, that whatever ailments circulate among those who bathe communally, they circulate efficiently. He does not dwell on it. He returns to his philosophical point. He was a Stoic. The water was the water. You accepted the water. That was, in the end, a very Roman position on the matter. And here is the part that reframes everything you have heard so far. The Romans knew, not in the way we know, not with germ theory, not with microbiology, not with the specific language of pathogen transmission, but they knew that the bathhouse produced certain outcomes in certain people. Physicians wrote about bathing, associated skin conditions. Celsus noted that communal bathing was inadvisable for patients with open wounds. Marcus Aurelius, emperor and Stoic philosopher, and a man who had access to the finest private facilities the empire could provide, expressed skepticism about the thermi in terms that his physicians probably found professionally validating. The response, broadly, was not to change the system. The response was to go earlier. The morning crowd was healthier, according to the medical advice of the period, and to choose your bathhouse carefully, and to exit the water before it became too crowded, and to apply the cold plunge thoroughly afterward. These were reasonable precautions within the knowledge available. They worked partially. They did not work completely. But the thermi continued for centuries, because a city of 1 million people needed somewhere to go, and the marble was genuinely beautiful, and the hypocaust floor was warm under bare feet, and Closina was presumably watching over the drainage, and you had a sausage and a conversation and a scraping and an afternoon, and sometimes that was sufficient. The water wasn't clean. It was Rome. The water, of course, went somewhere. And where Roman water went, through the pipes that fed the fountains and the baths and the private connections that the wealthy had installed with varying degrees of official permission, is its own quiet catastrophe, one that the Romans built, maintained, consumed from daily, and did not connect to the specific set of symptoms that kept appearing in the records with a regularity that, in retrospect, is difficult to read as coincidence. The pipes were made of something. The something had a name, and the name is where this gets worse. Welcome to the water supply. Specifically, welcome to the moment you turn the handle, or rather, the moment you open the stopcock, because Romans did not have handles in the modern sense. They had valves and sluices and a network of small adjustments that controlled the flow of water through a system so extensive that modern engineers still study it with something approaching reverence and something approaching alarm. The aqueducts are the famous part. 11 of them feeding Rome at the city's height, carrying water from springs and rivers across arches of cut stone for tens of miles, maintaining a gradient so precise that the water arrived under pressure and distributed itself through the city by gravity alone. The aqueducts are genuinely extraordinary. What happened to the water after the aqueducts is a different story. You are in a domus, a private house of reasonable means, not the imperial palace, not a senator's compound, but the home of a successful merchant or a prosperous freedman or a mid-tier official has done well enough to have a private water connection, which is a luxury and a status marker, and, as it turns out, the specific mechanism of a problem that built quietly over decades and arrived without fanfare and was never, in any Roman text, correctly identified for what it was. The water enters the house through a pipe. The pipe is lead. The Latin word for pipe is fistula. The Latin word for lead is plumbum. The English word plumber descends directly from plumbum, which is one of those etymological facts that sits in the brain differently once you know what you are about to know. Roman water pipes were made of lead because lead was the logical choice. It was abundant, a byproduct of silver smelting, produced in enormous quantities across the empire's mining operations in Spain, Britain, and elsewhere. It was workable, soft enough to be shaped and joined without sophisticated tooling, pliable enough to follow the curves a distribution system required. It did not corrode in the way iron corroded. It was watertight when properly fitted. It was, by every practical engineering criterion, the Romans applied to the problem of distributing water through a dense urban environment, the correct material. There were Roman voices that expressed something like concern. Vitruvius, the architect and engineer whose work on building has survived nearly complete, noted in the 1st century before the Common Era that water carried through lead pipes was not as healthful as water carried through clay pipes, and that workers in lead foundries suffered particular ailments. He recommended clay where possible. He was not, as far as the record shows, widely heeded. The lead pipes continued. The system expanded. By the height of the empire, lead pipes ran beneath the streets of Rome and every major city in the Roman world, connecting aqueduct terminals to fountains, to private houses, to bathhouses, to imperial kitchens. The water that came through those pipes did not carry enough dissolved lead to kill you in a week. This is important. This is why the problem persisted for centuries without producing a clear signal anyone could follow to its source. Lead poisoning at low chronic doses is not dramatic. It does not produce a sudden collapse. It produces, over years of daily exposure, a quiet accumulation in the bones, in the soft tissue, in the blood, that manifests as fatigue, as irritability, as a gradual dulling of certain cognitive functions, as reproductive difficulty, as a slow general decline that physicians of the period diagnosed as various other things because various other things were also happening, and the connection between the pipe and the symptom was not one the available intellectual framework could make. There is one Roman sweetener so widely used that it appears in almost every cookbook that survives from the period. It has a pleasant name. It was produced through a specific process involving a specific vessel. The vessel is the detail that changes the meaning of the name entirely. We will come back to the process. The pipes were one vector. They were not the only one. Sapa was a grape syrup, a reduction of unfermented grape juice, cooked down to a thick, sweet concentrate used as a sweetener, a preservative, a base for sauces, a corrective for wine that had gone sour. Roman cuisine used it extensively. It appears in Apicius, the surviving Roman cookbook, in recipe after recipe, sapa added to the fish sauce, sapa stirred into the wine, sapa drizzled over the roasted meat. It was the standard sweetener of a culinary tradition that had not yet encountered cane sugar and found honey expensive and honey, sweetened wine not quite right for certain preparations. Sapa was produced by reduction, the grape juice cooked over a low fire for hours, losing water, concentrating sugar and flavor. The cooking vessel was typically lead, lined bronze. The choice was not arbitrary. lead vessels conducted heat evenly, did not react with acidic content in a way that produced off flavors, and produced a final product that was, in the experience of every Roman cook who had compared lead vessel sapa to clay vessel sapa, sweeter and more pleasant, they were right that it was sweeter. The lead vessel was dissolving trace amounts of lead acetate into the reduction as it cooked. Lead acetate is sweet. Its alternative name, used in some periods and some languages, is sugar of lead. It is a genuine sweetener, functional, palatable, and a cumulative neurotox, with particular affinity for the developing nervous system and the reproductive organs. The Romans added it to wine, not just through sapa directly. Lead acetate was added to wine that had gone sour to correct the taste. It was added to new wine to stabilize it. The practice appears in agricultural manuals. It appears in Pliny. It appears in Columella, who wrote extensively on the management of the Roman wine estate, and recommended lead or lead-lined vessels for must reduction with the confidence of someone passing on well-established best practice. Roman wine consumption among the upper classes, the classes with access to wine of sufficient quality to be worth correcting, the classes with private water connections, the classes who ate from lead vessel kitchens daily, was substantial. Several liters per day, in some accounts, diluted with water as the custom dictated, the water coming through lead pipes, the wine carrying its own lead content from the vessel, and the deliberate addition, the food arriving in sauces that had been reduced in lead cookware. The accumulation was not theoretical. Modern forensic analysis of Roman skeletal remains, drawn from burial sites across the empire, across centuries, across social classes, has found lead concentrations in bone that exceed pre-industrial baseline exposure by factors of 10 to 100. The upper-class skeletons show the highest concentrations. The skeletons of the wealthy, the connected, the powerful, the people with private water connections and lead, corrected wine and sapa in their daily diet, carry the most lead. The bodies of the people who could not afford private water connections, who drank from public fountains and ate simply, and could not afford the wine worth correcting, carry less. Disease wasn't distributed evenly. It followed the infrastructure, and the infrastructure was beautiful. The sweetener, sapa, de frutum, in its more reduced form. The name means, essentially, cook-down must a processing description, neutral, domestic, entirely unremarkable in the context of a Roman kitchen. What it does not mean, anywhere in its etymology or its usage in surviving texts, is lead. Nobody called it lead syrup. Nobody labeled it poison. It was sapa. It was in the recipe. You used it. Roman physicians noticed things. This is worth saying directly, because the image of Roman medicine as pure superstition does not survive careful reading of the texts. Dioscorides described symptoms we would now recognize as lead poisoning. Nicander of Colophon, 2 centuries earlier, had described them more explicitly still. Galen noted the particular damage done to the digestive system by lead compounds. Paul of Aegina, writing in the 7th century CE, had a clearer picture than most of his predecessors. None of them connected the pipe to the symptom. None connected the sapa to the miscarriage rate. None traced the tremor in the senator's hands back to the wine he had been drinking for 30 years from the vessel in his cellar. The framework did not permit that connection. The framework had other explanations, and the other explanations were sufficient, and the pipe continued to carry the water, and the cook continued to reach for the lead vessel, and the wine merchant continued to correct the vintage. Imagine explaining this to a modern person, not the lead poisoning, which they would understand immediately, but the specific texture of not knowing, of having smart, careful, observant people noticing every individual symptom and missing the cause entirely, not from stupidity, but from the shape of the available knowledge, which had a gap in exactly the right place for the lead to pass through unnoticed. That is not a Roman failure. That is what it looks like when a civilization is standing inside its own blind spot. And while Lead was moving through Roman kitchens and Roman veins, building quietly in the bones of the senator and the wine merchant and the successful freedman with the private water connection, something else was happening in the private rooms of those same houses. Something the Romans had strong opinions about, something their physicians tracked carefully, and their philosophers addressed directly, and their literature treated as a subject of serious inquiry. The Romans had rules about sleep, specific, physiological, morally weighted rules about sleep, about what position, what hour, what conditions, what the body did during the night, and what those things meant, and what happened when the night produced something the Romans considered a medical event rather than merely a dream. The bedroom was its own system, and the bedroom had its own problems. Welcome to the Roman bedroom. It is late. The lamps are burning low olive oil lamps, small clay things, producing a flame about the size of a thumbnail that gives enough light to navigate by and enough smoke to leave a faint deposit on the ceiling over years of use. The ceiling of this room has a dark smear above the lamp hook that has been there since before you moved in. You have stopped noticing it. Romans stopped noticing things efficiently. It was a survival skill. The room is small. Roman domestic architecture allocated space by function and status, and the bedroom, the cubiculum, was not the room that received the generous allocation. The atrium was generous. The triclinium, the dining room, was generous. The garden, if you had one, was the jewel. The cubiculum was the room you slept in, which meant it needed to contain a bed, a lamp, a chamber pot, and enough floor space to stand beside the bed without incident. In a wealthy household, the cubiculum might also contain a small chest, a stool, a hanging for privacy. In a modest insula apartment, it might contain only the bed, and the bed might be shared. The bed, the lectus, was a wooden frame, rope or leather webbing stretched across it to support the sleeper. A mattress of wool or straw on top of the webbing. A pillow of similar construction. Wealthy households had feather mattresses goose down, sometimes swan, which were expensive and aspirational and mentioned in wills. Everyone else had wool. The wool compressed over time. The straw shifted. The ropes stretched and sagged toward the center, which meant that two people sharing a bed tended to roll toward each other regardless of intention, which the Romans acknowledged and did not find particularly interesting. The insects they found more interesting. Bed bugs appear in Roman literature with the frequency of something that was simply present, a condition of sleeping rather than a problem to be solved. Pliny the Elder mentioned them. Pliny mentioned most things at length, with the organizational enthusiasm of a man who had decided to write down everything and largely succeeded. His account of bed bugs includes their Latin name simices, their habitat, their behavior, and several proposed remedies involving wild gall, deer fat, and the strategic placement of certain plants beneath the mattress frame. The remedies did not work. The sources are quietly clear on this. Bed bugs were in the mattress, in the rope webbing, in the cracks of the wooden frame, in the wall behind the bed, in the floor below the bed. They had been in Roman beds for as long as there had been Roman beds, and would continue to be in Roman beds for as long as there were Roman beds, which was the entire remaining duration of Rome. And beyond, you slept with them, you woke with the evidence of them. You noted this in the same register you noted the smear on the ceiling above the lamp hook. It was the bed. This was what beds were. What you did about your position in that bed, however, was a matter of medical opinion, and Roman medical opinion on sleep position was specific, confident, and delivered with the authority of people who had read Hippocrates carefully and extrapolated from him freely. The left side was correct. Sleeping on the left side aided digestion. The stomach, in humeral anatomy, sat slightly to the left, and lying on the left kept it settled. kept the contents moving in the right direction, prevented the various obstructions and vapors that accumulated when the body was positioned incorrectly. Celsus recommended it. Galen had opinions about it. The right side was acceptable for brief intervals, but not for sustained sleep. The back was dangerous. Sleeping on the back, supine, face upward, was associated with nightmares, with nocturnal emissions, with a specific category of sleep disturbance the Romans called the incubus, which did not yet mean what it would later mean to medieval demonology, but meant, in the Roman medical context, the sensation of pressure on the chest during sleep, what we would now recognize as sleep paralysis. This was considered a physiological event, not a supernatural one, the result of incorrect positioning causing an improper distribution of vapors through the body during the night. The cure was to roll left. The Romans were not entirely wrong about this. Sleep position does affect certain physiological processes. The confidence was correct even where the mechanism was not. There is a Roman dream manual that survives almost completely intact. It was written in the 2nd century CE and runs to 5 books. It categorizes hundreds of dream images and their meanings, not symbolically, in the way a modern dream dictionary might, but predictively, in the way a physician might categorize symptoms. Its author believed, and argued at length, that dreams were a diagnostic tool, and that a careful reader of dreams could determine the future state of the dreamer's health, finances, relationships, and social standing from the content of a night's visions. There is one entry in it that scholars have been arguing about for 2 centuries. We will get to that entry. Nocturnal emissions were a medical event in Rome. Not a moral one, not primarily, though the moral dimension existed in philosophical writing, but a physiological one, tracked, discussed with physicians, understood as a symptom with diagnostic implications. Galen wrote about them. Aretaeus of Cappadocia wrote about them at length, and with the clinical specificity of someone who had collected a great deal of patient data. The loss of what Roman medicine termed the vital pneuma, the animating substance the body produced and conserved, through nocturnal emissions was considered a drain on the overall constitution. Too frequent, and the body weakened, physicians asked about them, patients reported them, they appeared in case notes. The management involved sleep position. Back sleeping was again implicated, diet, exercise, and in some cases the application of cold water to the relevant region before sleep, which was either a deterrent or a treatment depending on which physician you consulted, and what they believed about temperature's effect on the pneuma. This was not prudishness. Rome was not prudish. This was physiology. The body produced a substance. The substance was finite and important. Its conservation was a medical matter, pursued with the same practical attention the Romans brought to aqueduct maintenance and bread supply. The dream life of this body, sleeping on its left side, conserving its pneuma, fighting off its bed bugs, that dream life was equally practical in its Roman management. Dream incubation was the practice of sleeping in a temple specifically to receive a divine message. The god Asclepius, god of medicine, maintained temples, Asclepia across the Roman world where the sick came to sleep, to dream, and to receive in those dreams a diagnosis or a cure, or simply reassurance that they were being attended to by something larger than a physician with a strigil and a bowl of vinegar. The preparation required ritual bathing, specific dietary restrictions in the days before the visit, the offering of particular gifts at the altar, and then sleep on the floor of the temple or on a special couch in the more elaborate establishments, and the careful recording of whatever the night produced. The dreams were then interpreted by the temple priests. The interpretations were taken seriously. Patients recovered, sometimes, or believed they recovered, which in the case of chronic conditions without clear physical cause was not always a meaningless distinction. Aelius Aristides a Roman orator of the 2nd century CE, kept a detailed record of his years seeking treatment at the Asclepieion at Pergamon. His account runs to thousands of words. It is one of the stranger documents Roman antiquity has produced, and it is entirely sincere. He believed he was not unusual in believing. The dream, in Rome, was not entertainment, it was information. The Dream Manual. Artemidorus of Daldis, 2nd century CE, the Oneirocritica, 5 books on the interpretation of dreams, organized by category, exhaustive, precise, and convinced of its own utility in a way that is either admirable or unsettling depending on your relationship with confidence. Artemidorus categorized dreams into 2 types, the Enhypnean, which reflected the current physical and mental state of the dreamer and had no predictive value, and the Oneiros, which carried genuine prophetic content and required interpretation. The distinction mattered enormously. Getting it wrong meant either ignoring a genuine warning or spending significant mental energy interpreting what was effectively a symptom of indigestion. His entries are specific. Dreaming of a mirror meant a woman would become pregnant. Dreaming of writing tablets meant either a legal problem or a letter, depending on the context. Dreaming of losing teeth, which appears in dream interpretation manuals from virtually every culture that has produced them, meant in Artemidorus the death of a family member, with specific teeth corresponding to specific relatives in a taxonomy he worked out and defended at length. The flying entry. Here it is. Dreaming of flying in almost every other tradition that has recorded an opinion on the matter carried positive valence, freedom, transcendence, the escape from earthly constraint, the soul's natural aspiration. Artemidorus looked at the flying dream and saw something different. Flight, in his system, indicated financial ruin. The dreamer would rise. The dreamer would have no ground beneath them. The dreamer would eventually come down. The trajectory of the dream, read economically rather than spiritually, described debt. Scholars have been puzzling over this for 2 centuries because it is so specifically contrary to every other interpretive tradition, not just modern intuition, but ancient intuition from Greece. Egypt, Mesopotamia, all of which tended toward the positive reading. Artemidorus either had access to a patient population that had specific associations with flight drawn from the mechanics of Roman financial catastrophe, or he was working from an interpretive principle so internally consistent that it reached the opposite conclusion from everyone else and was equally confident about it. The confidence is, in some ways, the most Roman thing about it. Imagine explaining this to a modern person, that the most optimistic dream image available to the sleeping mind, the sensation of rising, weightless, above everything, was, to a careful Roman reader, a warning to check your accounts in the morning. Flight wasn't freedom. It was a financial instrument pointed downward. And that is where we leave the Roman bedroom on the left side, on the wool mattress, with the bed bugs and the lamp smoke, and the dream manual open on the stool beside the bed, and the lead from the water and the wine settling quietly into the bones, and Closina somewhere in the dark watching over the drainage. Rome was not a clean civilization. It was a managed one. It managed its sewers and its water and its faces and its smells and its sleeping positions and its dreams with the same administrative confidence it brought to everything. The confidence of a civilization that had decided it, knew how things worked, and was mostly right about some of it. But while Rome was cataloging its nightmares and scraping its skin and sweetening its wine with something, nobody should have sweetened anything with far to the north. In a different kind of cold, in a different kind of city, a different kind of practitioner was already at work. He had a chair, he had a set of tools. Some of those tools were for hair, some were for teeth, some were for things that the word barbershop has never, in the modern world, been asked to cover. And the pole outside his door meant something. It still does. You have seen it your entire life and never known what it meant. By the end of the next hour, you will. Long before the hospital existed, before the physician was a licensed profession, before anyone had agreed on what the body actually contained or what to do when it stopped cooperating, the person most likely to cut you open was also the person most likely to cut your hair. This is not a metaphor. This is a job description. In medieval Europe, across several centuries and several kingdoms, the barber and the surgeon occupied the same chair, the same room, the same set of hands. The hands that shaped your beard on Tuesday were the hands that removed your tooth on Wednesday, and, if Wednesday went badly, addressed the consequences on Thursday. The tools hung on the same wall. The basin on the floor caught whatever the morning required. The pole outside the door told you what kind of establishment this was, and what kind of morning you might be having, and it has been standing on streets in the modern world ever since, in red and white and sometimes blue, and almost nobody alive knows what it is actually saying. We are going to spend some time in this room. Pull the chair closer. The light is better near the window. In the year 1163, the Council of Tours issued a decree that has a specific Latin phrase at its center, asterisk ecclesia abhorret, a sanguine asterisk, which translates, roughly, as the church abhors bloodshed. The decree was directed at monks and clergy who had been practicing surgery alongside their religious duties, which was common and, from the perspective of the council, no longer acceptable. The church had decided that cutting into human bodies was incompatible with holy orders. Monks were to step back from the operating table. Someone had to step forward. The barbers were already there. They had been there in a practical sense for longer than the decree acknowledged. Barbers worked with blades. Barbers worked with the face and the neck and the scalp, the regions of the body most likely to require minor interventions of a medical nature, lancing an abscess, draining a cyst, cleaning and dressing a wound that had arrived from somewhere else and needed management. The skills were adjacent. The tools overlapped. The clientele was the same. The transition from barber to barber, surgeon, was, in the daily life of a medieval town, less a professional revolution than an acknowledgement of what was already happening. Formal guild structures came later. In England, the Company of Barber-Surgeons was incorporated in 1540, bringing the two trades under one organizational roof, which they occupied together, uneasily, for 2 centuries before. Surgeons decided they were tired of sharing and left. In France, the division came earlier and with more animosity. In most of the rest of Europe, the arrangement existed in various forms of official and unofficial combination across the medieval and early modern periods. The distinction between the barber, surgeon, and the physician, the university, trained Lat, in reading Galen, quoting physician, was the distinction between the hands and the head. Physicians diagnosed, physicians prescribed. Physicians did not, as a professional matter, cut. Cutting was manual labor. Cutting was the barber-surgeon's domain. The physician sat across the room and told you what was wrong. The barber-surgeon stood beside you and did something about it, for a lower fee, with more immediate results, and with a survival rate that was approximately the same. The barber pole stands on most streets in the modern world, and nobody knows what it means. The red, the white, the blue in American versions, the spinning, the shape, all of it is information encoded in the medieval period and preserved without translation into the present. By the end of this arc, you will know what it means, and you will not look at one the same way again. The barber-surgeon's table was not a surgical theater. It was not a hospital bed. It was, in most cases, a chair, sometimes the barber's chair, sometimes a stool, sometimes simply whatever was available in the room, and around it the tools were arranged with the pragmatic organization of someone who needed to find things quickly and did not have the luxury of losing the lancet. The lance, it was the primary tool of bloodletting, a small, short, bladed instrument, sharp, pointed, designed to pierce a vein cleanly and open it to a controlled bleed. Bloodletting was not a fringe practice. It was the central therapeutic intervention of medieval medicine, drawn from humoral theory, the Galenic system that organized the body around 4 humors, blood being the most abundant and most frequently implicated in whatever was wrong, and applied to virtually every condition a patient might present with, including conditions that today would be treated with blood transfusion rather than removal. The logic was internally consistent. Too much blood or blood of the wrong quality, heated and thickened by fever or by excess, caused imbalance. Remove the excess, restore the balance, the patient would improve. Sometimes the patient improved. In cases of genuine hypertension, genuine polycythemia, conditions involving excess blood or elevated pressure, bloodletting produced real, measurable relief. Medieval physicians had no way to know why it worked in those cases and not others, so they applied it to all cases, which meant it worked intermittently, and the intermittent success was sufficient to maintain the practice for 1,000 years. The Barber-Surgeon managed the lancet. He also managed the phlegm, a larger instrument for opening bigger vessels, and the leeches, which were the alternative delivery mechanism for the same therapeutic goal. Leeches were applied to the skin, allowed to feed until engorged, then removed. They were preferred for delicate areas, for patients too weak for the lancet, for situations where a controlled small bleed was the objective. The Barber-Surgeon kept leeches in a jar. The jar was on the same shelf as the tooth instruments. The prescribed volume of blood to remove per session varied by physician, by season, by the patient's constitution and the condition being treated. Spring was the primary bloodletting season, the body warming after winter, the blood presumed to be stirring and potentially excessive. Autumn was secondary. The amount removed in a session might range from a few ounces to nearly a liter, depending on the ambition of the prescription and the stamina of the patient. A specific detail that appears in the records without much comment. The Barber-Surgeon was responsible for monitoring the patient during the bleed. He watched for the point at which the blood changed color, brightened, thinned, which indicated sufficient removal. He watched for faintness. He watched for the gray tone around the mouth that meant the session had gone slightly further than intended. At that point, he closed the vein, applied pressure, bound the arm, and helped the patient to a chair if the patient was not already seated, which they usually were, having learned from experience. It was a system. It had a logic. The logic was wrong in its foundations and occasionally right in its outcomes and entirely confident throughout. And here is the part that most histories quietly step around. The tooth extraction. Bloodletting was managed. It had protocols, training, an established sequence of steps that the Barber-Surgeon had performed dozens of times and could execute with reasonable consistency. Tooth extraction was different. Tooth extraction was, in the medieval period, a problem that arrived without warning, demanded immediate resolution, and offered almost no good options for the patient in the chair. The instrument was called the pelican, not because it resembled a pelican in any obvious way. The etymology is disputed, but because it was the standard term for the lever and claw device used to grip a tooth and remove it from the jaw. The pelican had a curved arm, a rotating claw that seated against the crown of the tooth, and a fulcrum that rested on the adjacent gum or tooth to provide leverage. The Barber-Surgeon seated the claw, set the fulcrum, and rotated the arm. The tooth came out, or it did not come out cleanly, or it came out in pieces, or it came out along with a portion of the surrounding bone and tissue, which was the worst outcome, but not an unusual one. There was no anesthesia. There were preparations, wine in quantity, administered before the procedure, herbal preparations containing henbane or mandrake, both of which contain genuine alkaloids with sedative properties, administered in doses that were estimated rather than measured. The patient was held, in the more honestly documented accounts, by an assistant or by whoever in the room was large enough to be useful. The barber-surgeon worked quickly. Speed was the mercy on offer. Afterward, the wound was packed with various preparations, oil of cloves, which contains eugenol and genuinely reduces pain, lint soaked in wine, in some accounts, a cauterizing application. If bleeding was severe, the patient went home, the jaw swelled. The barber-surgeon moved to the next chair. The fee was negotiated beforehand. This was standard. You did not want to be negotiating after. The pole. Here is what it says. The red stripe represents blood. The white stripe represents the bandage, the linen cloth used to dress wounds and bind arms after bloodletting. These two elements appear in the earliest documented descriptions of the barber-surgeon's sign. A pole wound with red and white cloth, the cloth used in the morning's procedures, hung outside to dry, turning slowly in the wind. The pole itself, in some accounts, was what the patient gripped during the bleed, something to hold, something to press against, to keep the arm still and the hand occupied. The spinning, the rotating motion of the modern illuminated pole represents the twisting of the cloth as it dried. That is what is spinning. Dried blood and used bandage, immortalized in plastic and neon, mounted outside barber shops across the modern world. The blue stripe in the American version has several claimed origins. One holds that it represents the venous blood darker oxygen, depleted as distinct from the brighter arterial red. Another holds that it was added for patriotic reasons in the post-revolutionary period, and has no medical meaning whatsoever. The historical community has not fully resolved this. The blue may mean something. The blue may mean nothing, except that someone in the 19th century thought it looked better.
The basin, the brass bowl that appears in some historical barber-surgeon imagery, mounted below the pole or carried by the surgeon, caught the blood during the bleed when the patient held the
arm extended over it, and the lance, it opened the vein, and the barber-surgeon watched the color and the volume and made his judgment. The same basin, cleaned and dried, was used for shaving lather. This is what is standing outside your barber shop. This is what has been standing there, unchanged in its essential symbolism, since the medieval period. The pole is not decorative. The pole is a medical advertisement, preserved past the point of anyone remembering what it advertised. It was a sign, it still is. You just forgot what it was saying. The barber-surgeon's table was, at least, visible. What the physicians were doing, the university men, the Latin readers, the ones who did not cut, happened behind closed doors with documents and charts and a flask of your urine and a confidence that was, if anything, more absolute than the barber-surgeon's, despite having less direct contact with the patient and considerably more contact with a set of ideas that had not been seriously questioned since Galen wrote them down in the 2nd century CE. The flask was everything. The flask was the diagnostic instrument. And what the physician saw in that flask, the color, the clarity, the smell, and in some documented cases the taste told him, with a certainty that was entirely genuine and occasionally correct, exactly what was wrong with you. Welcome to the physician's consulting room. It is not what you expected. There is no table of instruments, that is the barber-surgeon's domain, and the physician has opinions about the barber-surgeon that he will share if you give him the opportunity, which you should not do if you have somewhere to be. There is a desk. There are books, expensive hand-copied, the kind of books that represent decades of a scholar's accumulated debt. There is a candle, because there is always a candle, and the candle is burning close to a page covered in the kind of Latin that takes years to read fluently, and a particular kind of patience to find useful, and there is a flask. The flask is on the desk, in a shaft of window light, and it is the center of everything in this room. It is glass, genuine glass, which is not cheap, shaped like a globe at the bottom and narrowing at the neck, designed specifically for this purpose, this examination, this diagnostic moment that the physician has organized his entire professional life around. The flask has a name, the matula, and what is inside the matula has traveled some distance to be here. You have not traveled with it. That is the first thing to understand about medieval uroscopy. The flask arrived. You did not have to. In the case of a wealthy patient, a nobleman, a merchant of sufficient means, a bishop with a household, a servant was dispatched with the morning sample in the matula, wrapped in a wicker basket lined with cloth to prevent breakage, carried through the streets with the careful attention you would give to something that costs money to replace and contains something irreplaceable. The physician received it, the physician examined it, the physician sent back a diagnosis, the patient across town waited. This was not considered unusual. This was standard practice, conducted across medieval Europe for several centuries, endorsed by medical authorities, and defended in the literature with arguments that, within their own framework, made complete sense. The physician had not seen you. He had seen your urine. In the medieval medical world, that was frequently sufficient. The matula's shape was not arbitrary. It was designed to mirror the shape of the bladder, the globe at the bottom corresponding to the organ, the neck to the urethra, because the visual relationship between the vessel and the organ it represented was part of the diagnostic logic. The physician held the matula up to the light, rotated it slowly, and read it the way a navigator reads the sky. Color, clarity, consistency, sediment, what had settled, what was suspended, what floated at the surface. The ring around the neck of the flask, the behavior of the sample when the flask was gently agitated. Each observation mapped to the urine wheel. The urine wheel was a diagnostic chart, a circular diagram organized by color, running from the palest possible urine at one end of the spectrum to the darkest at the other, with 20 distinct gradations between them. Each color had a name, a description, a set of associated conditions, and a prognosis. The wheel was not a single document. Different physicians, different medical schools, different centuries produced different versions, with variations in the color names and the associated conditions, but the underlying structure was consistent enough that a physician trained in one tradition could navigate another's wheel without significant difficulty. The colors moving through the spectrum, white as whey, pale as water, pale yellow, lemon yellow, golden yellow, deep yellow, these were the healthier registers indicating various states of hydration and metabolic function that, in humoral terms, mapped to the balance of the relevant qualities. Moving further, orange, reddish, red, deep red, these indicated heat, inflammation, the presence of conditions associated with excess or corrupted blood. Further still, green, blue-green, these were the disturbing registers indicating severe imbalance, conditions the physician named carefully and the patient received with the specific stillness of someone being told something they did not want confirmed. And then the final color, black. There were 20 colors on the urine wheel. 19 had associated conditions, prognoses, recommended treatments, the full apparatus of humoral medicine applied to the diagnostic finding. The notation beside black urine in several of the surviving wheel manuscripts is notably brief. In Latin, it runs to approximately 3 words. Translated, it reads in various versions: asterisk make arrangements asterisk or asterisk settle affairs asterisk, or in one manuscript's particularly direct rendering, asterisk this one dies. Asterisk there is a detail in the surviving wheel manuscripts that most accounts of medieval uroscopy do not pause on. 19 colors have treatments. The 20th has a note. 3 words. We will come back to those 3 words, and to what the physician was expected to do with a flask that had arrived at that particular point on the wheel. The examination began with color, and moved through a sequence that the physician had been trained to follow in a specific order. Color first, held to the light, assessed against the wheel, noted. Then clarity. Was the sample clear, cloudy, turbid, thick. Clarity indicated the degree of processing the kidneys had performed, the state of the digestive system, the presence of suspended material that should not be suspended. Then consistency, thin as water, or thick, or viscous, in a way that the physician noted with a word that appears in the Latin texts as something between syrupy and ominous. Then sediment. The sediment was examined in 3 layers. What had settled to the bottom of the macula, the hypostasis, corresponded diagnostically to the lower regions of the body, the digestive organs, the bladder itself. What was suspended in the middle, the anaerma, corresponded to the middle regions, the chest, the vital organs. What floated at the surface, the annubulum, corresponded to the upper regions, the head, the brain, the sensory organs. A skilled physician could, in theory, read the entire body from the 3 layers of a single flask. The ring, the circle of material that sometimes formed around the neck of the macula, was its own diagnostic category, indicating conditions of the head and neck in a specificity that the texts pursue with complete confidence, and that modern nephrology regards with a mixture of genuine interest and careful silence. Smell was part of the examination. This is documented clearly. Sweet-smelling urine, what we would now recognize as a possible indicator of diabetes. The glucose content producing a distinctive odor was noted and associated with specific conditions. Putrid smell indicated corruption of one kind or another. Ammonia, sharp, indicated the sample had been kept too long before examination, which created its own diagnostic problem. How much of what the physician was smelling was the patient, and how much was the journey? Taste appears in the sources, not universally, not in every tradition, not endorsed by every authority, but it appears. Some physicians tasted, some texts recommend it for specific diagnostic questions. Sweet taste, specifically, appears in several accounts as a confirmatory test for the sweet-smelling sample. Johannicius, whose **Isagoge** was a foundational medical text in medieval European universities, did not explicitly recommend tasting, but did not prohibit it. Later commentators went different directions. The practice existed. The extent of its use is genuinely unclear and probably varied by individual physician, by region, and by how strongly the physician felt about the alternative. The 3 words, the black notation. Here is what the physician was expected to do. He was expected to send the servant back with the diagnosis. This is where the remote consultation model encountered its most serious practical difficulty. The news that the urine wheel placed your master's sample at the terminal point of the spectrum was news that had to travel back through the streets in the hands of a servant, delivered to a household that had sent the macula out that morning with the ordinary anxiety of illness, and was now being asked to receive something considerably more final. The physician's response to black urine in the surviving texts is described in terms that are careful and consistent. Tell the truth. Medieval medical ethics on this point were more direct than modern sensibility might expect. The patient had a right to know, had practical and spiritual affairs to organize, had a confessor to summon, had a will to confirm or revise. The physician's role in that moment was not to soften, but to be clear. The macula had spoken, the wheel had been consulted. The 3 words were the professional opinion, delivered with as much gentleness as 3 words permit, and as much certainty as the wheel could provide. Which was considerable certainty, possibly too much certainty, given what we now know about the diagnostic accuracy of urine color as a mortality predictor. But the physician did not know what we know. The physician knew the wheel. The wheel had 20 colors. This was the 20th. Imagine explaining this to a modern person, not the diagnosis, which a modern physician might deliver with similar finality under different circumstances, but the mechanism. That the information traveled in a glass flask in a wicker basket through medieval streets, that a man examined it in window light and matched it to a color chart, that the color chart ended in 3 words, and that those 3 words were considered sufficient professional, and kind. Medicine wasn't uncertainty. It was a wheel, and the wheel had an end. The urine told the physician what was wrong. It did not tell him what to do about it, or rather, it told him in general terms that required translation into specific action, which was the work of the herbalist, the apothecary, the monastery garden, and the accumulated practical knowledge of several centuries of people treating sick bodies with whatever the landscape provided, and whatever the Greek texts recommended, and whatever their own observation had taught them to trust. The herbs, it turns out, were the most interesting part, because some of them worked. Not metaphorically, not in the humoral sense of restoring balance among the four qualities, actually worked, chemically, in ways that the people prescribing them could not explain and did not need to explain, because the patient got better, and the patient getting better was the point. The monastery garden deserves its own accounting. And there is one plant in it that appears in almost every pain formula that survives from the medieval period. It is still in your medicine cabinet. You have taken it recently, probably, and for 400 years nobody knew why it worked. Welcome to the physic garden. It is early morning, the canonical hour of prime has just passed, which means the bells have rung and the monks have sung, and the day has officially begun in the way monastery days began, with structure, with regularity, with the particular discipline of people who had decided that the body's tendency toward chaos was best managed by giving it very little choice in the matter. The light is coming in low and horizontal across the garden beds, catching the dew on the broad leaves of the plantain and the feathery tops of the fennel and the green sprawl of the sage that has been allowed over several seasons to expand beyond its designated plot and into the territory of the rue, which nobody has addressed because the monk responsible for the rue section died last winter, and his replacement has not yet formed strong opinions about borders. The garden is not large. It does not need to be. It needs to contain, with reasonable reliability, the plants that the infirmarian, the monk responsible for the care of the sick, within the monastery and sometimes beyond it, has determined are necessary. The infirmarian has a list. The list is very old. Parts of it go back to Charlemagne. In the year 812 CE, Charlemagne issued a document called the Capitulaire de Villiers, a decree governing the management of royal estates across the Frankish kingdom. It is, on its surface, an agricultural policy document. It specifies crop rotations, animal husbandry practices, the obligations of estate managers to the crown. Tucked inside it, without particular fanfare, is a list of 73 plants that every royal estate must cultivate. The list includes food plants, spice plants, and plants that are neither food nor spice but medicine. Specific herbs chosen for specific therapeutic purposes, mandated at the level of imperial decree, distributed across the landscape of medieval Europe by the force of Carolingian administration. This is a medical policy document wearing agricultural clothing. Charlemagne, or more likely the scholars at his court who drafted the document, had decided that the empire's health depended on a standardized pharmacopoeia, distributed through the estate system, maintained whether or not a physician was available, accessible to whoever was sick and whoever was caring for them. The monastery garden was the local implementation of that policy. The infirmarian was its administrator. He walks the beds in the early light, checking what is ready, what is not, what the season has done to the preparations he began in autumn. He has patience, he always has patience. The plants on Charlemagne's list were not chosen arbitrarily. Some of them we can trace directly to the Greek and Roman sources. Dioscorides, Galen, the herbalists whose texts had been copied and recopied through the early medieval period, translated imperfectly from Greek to Latin, annotated by monks who were working from manuscripts that were themselves copies of copies. The original observations now several removes from the plants they described. The infirmarian reading his Dioscorides was reading a text that had traveled 6 or 7 centuries from its composition, through multiple languages and multiple hands, and might contain corruptions he had no way to identify. He used it anyway. He used it carefully. He was within the limits of what he had, an empiricist. He observed what worked, noted what did not, and adjusted his practice over years of treating bodies that gave him feedback whether he asked for it or not. Bitani stachys bitonica, a common European plant with purple flowers and a long history of use, appeared on Charlemagne's list and in virtually every medieval herbal. It was prescribed for headaches, for anxiety, for digestive disturbance, for a range of conditions so broad that modern pharmacologists examining the historical record have noted, with the careful neutrality of people who do not want to overstate their findings, that Bitani probably did something, though exactly what remains somewhat unclear. The range of conditions it was applied to suggests either a genuinely functional plant or the kind of therapeutic overconfidence that attaches to anything that works once in a visible way. Feverfew Tanacetum parthenium was prescribed for fever. The name says so. The application made sense within the humoral framework. The plant was classified as cooling. It was applied to conditions characterized by heat. The fever was a condition of excess heat. What nobody knew, and what modern pharmacology has confirmed, is that feverfew contains compounds, parthenolide, primarily that inhibit certain inflammatory pathways and have a genuine effect on migraine frequency when taken regularly. The medieval physician prescribing feverfew for head pain was not wrong. He was right for reasons he could not have articulated and would not have recognized as reasons. Henbane Hyoscyamus niger was prescribed for pain. It contains hyoscine and hyoscyamine, genuine alkaloids with genuine sedative and analgesic properties. It also contains enough of those alkaloids at sufficient doses to kill you, which the medieval herbalists knew. Their texts contain warnings about quantity, about preparation, about the specific population of patients for whom henbane was contraindicated. The warnings are imprecise by modern standards, but not absent. They knew it was dangerous. They used it anyway, because the alternative was a patient in sufficient pain that the risk calculation shifted. Mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, appears in surgical contexts. The root contains scopolamine and other alkaloids that produce sedation, hallucination, and at sufficient doses unconsciousness. Medieval surgical texts describe a preparation called the soporific sponge, a cloth soaked in a solution containing mandrake, henbane, and several other sedating plants, held under the patient's nose before an operation, intended to produce sufficient unconsciousness to allow the procedure to be completed. Whether it worked consistently is debated. Whether it worked at all in the sense of producing genuine surgical unconsciousness rather than a mildly confused patient who is still very much present for the experience depends on preparation, the dose, and the specific alkaloid content of the particular plants used, which varied by season, by soil, by how long the preparation had been stored. It was, within its limits, an attempt at anesthesia. An imprecise, unreliable, occasionally lethal attempt. But an attempt the monk who prepared it was not being superstitious. He was being practical with the chemistry available to him. There is one plant in this garden that appears in almost every pain formula that survives from the medieval period. Not just in the monastery tradition, in the folk tradition, in the household remedies, in the records of what ordinary people reached for when the pain was significant, and the physician was unavailable, which was most of the time. The plant has a pleasant name. The preparation is simple. And it works, actually works, chemically, in a way that took until the 19th century to explain, and that, once explained, produced one of the most widely used medicines in human history. We will get to the plant. The monk, physician, the infirmarian, to be precise about the title, occupied a position that the institutional church found periodically uncomfortable and practically indispensable. The Council of Tours in 1163, the same decree that had pushed the Barber-Surgeon into his particular role, had also expressed reservations about monks practicing medicine too extensively,
publicly, too far beyond the monastery walls.
The concern was partly about distraction from religious duties, partly about the moral hazard of monks becoming too embedded in the secular world and its complicated bodies. The monasteries continued practicing medicine. They had to. In many regions, the monastery infirmary was the only medical facility available, the monastic garden the only reliable source of specific plants, the monk, physician, the only person within a day's travel who had read anything by Galen. The institutional discomfort was real. The practical necessity was more real. The medicine continued. The bloodletting schedule was tied to the lunar calendar, which was tied to the liturgical calendar, which meant that the decision of when to bleed a patient was as much a matter of saints' days and moon phases as of the patient's current condition. Specific saints' days were considered auspicious for bloodletting. Others were prohibited. The moon's phase affected the presumed state of the body's fluids. The full moon associated with excess, the new moon with depletion, and the infirmarian calibrated his interventions accordingly. This sounds, from a modern position, like superstition wearing the clothes of medicine. It was not entirely that. The lunar calendar imposed a regularity on treatment intervals that had practical benefits entirely separate from any astrological logic. Patients bled on a schedule were patients whose condition was being monitored on a schedule, and monitoring is not nothing. The Saints' Day prohibition on certain interventions gave the body rest periods that were, in cases of overtreatment, genuinely useful. The framework was wrong. Some of the outcomes it produced were accidentally right. The distinction between warm and cold herbs, the humoral classification applied to every plant in the garden, organized the pharmacopoeia in a way that was consistent and teachable, which meant it could be transmitted across generations of infirmarians without requiring each one to start from direct observation. A student monk learning that pepper was hot and cucumber was cold, and that a patient presenting with a cold, wet condition required warm, dry remedies was learning a system that was internally coherent and practically navigable, even if the underlying theory bore no relationship to what we now understand about plant chemistry. Roughly 30% of the plants in a typical medieval herbal have been found by modern pharmacological analysis to have genuine therapeutic activity, compounds that do what the medieval herbalists claimed they did, through mechanisms the herbalists could not have identified. 30% is not impressive by modern standards. By any standard applied to a medical tradition operating without chemistry, without controlled trials, without microscopy, without the germ theory of disease, without most of the conceptual infrastructure that makes modern pharmacology possible, 30% is extraordinary. It means that the medieval monk in the physic garden, working from manuscripts 6 centuries old and the accumulated observation of his predecessors, was selecting effective treatments at a rate significantly better than chance. He was doing science without the word for it, without the method for it, without the institutional support for it. He was just watching what happened and writing it down. The plant, willow bark, Salix alba, the white willow, a tree so common in the medieval European landscape that it required no special cultivation, no imperial decree, no monastery garden allocation. It grew where water was. It was everywhere. And in its bark, prepared by boiling or by soaking in cold water and administering the resulting liquid to patients with pain or fever, there was something that worked. The compound is salicin. The body metabolizes salicin into salicylic acid. Salicylic acid is the active principle of aspirin acetylsalicylic acid, synthesized chemically in the 19th century introduced commercially by Bayer in 1899, now one of the most widely consumed medicines in the world. The medieval infirmarian prescribing willow bark tea for a patient with joint pain or fever was administering protoaspirin. Not because he knew about salicin, not because he understood the cyclooxygenase pathway that salicylic acid inhibits, because it worked, because someone before him had noticed it worked and written it down, and someone before that person had noticed the same thing, and the chain of observation ran back further than any single manuscript could trace. For 400 years of documented medieval medicine, the willow bark preparation appeared in formula after formula, recommended by writer after writer, used in monastery infirmaries and farmhouse kitchens and on campaign with armies, and nobody knew why it worked. They knew that it did. That was sufficient. That was, in some ways, the entirety of the empirical tradition the physic garden represented. The patient got better. The monk wrote it down. The next monk read what was written. The garden continued. It wasn't chemistry. It was patience. And patience, practiced across enough generations, produces something that resembles knowledge whether or not it can explain itself. The monastery garden was orderly, rational even in its own way within its own framework, which was a framework that had been doing the best it could with what it had for several hundred years and had produced along the way a willow bark tea that would eventually become aspirin and a soporific sponge that was trying, genuinely trying, to be anesthesia. What happened when the garden failed, when the herbs ran out, when the formulas produced nothing, when the disease came faster and stranger than any preparation could address, is where the medieval medical system showed its edges most clearly. And the disease that showed those edges most clearly arrived in 1347 on a Genoese trading ship and did not stop arriving for the better part of 3 years, by which point the garden was still standing, but a third of the people who had tended it were not. The response to that disease had a costume. The costume had a beak. The beak had contents. And the physician who wore it was, depending on the city and the contract and the year, either a dedicated professional doing the best medicine could offer, or a man who had decided that the fee was worth the risk, or both of those things simultaneously, which was most of them. Welcome to a city that is quieter than it should be. Not peaceful quiet. Not the quiet of a Sunday morning or the quiet of a library or the quiet of a room where someone is sleeping, and you have remembered just in time to lower your voice. This is a different kind of quiet. The kind that arrives when enough people have stopped making noise, that the noise itself becomes conspicuous by its absence. The carts are fewer. The market stalls are fewer. The arguments that spill out of tavern doors into the street, the ordinary, reassuring arguments of people who have enough energy to disagree about something, those are fewer too. It is 1348. The city is Siena, or Venice, or Paris, or any of a dozen cities that receive the same ship, or the same cart, or the same traveler carrying the same invisible passenger from the same direction, approximately the same terrible moment. The specifics of entry vary. The outcome does not vary. The outcome is always the same outcome, arriving at different speeds depending on the season, and the density and the particular cruelty of the local circumstances, but arriving. You have heard about it before it arrived. News traveled slowly in the medieval period, but fear traveled faster than news. And fear had been traveling west and north for 2 years before the ships docked in Sicily in October of 1347. You knew something was coming. You did not know what something looked like up close, and now you are learning, and the education is proceeding faster than you would prefer. On the street ahead of you, a figure is walking. The figure is wearing a long coat of waxed canvas, wide, brimmed leather hat, leather gloves reaching to the elbow, glass lenses fitted into a leather mask that covers the face entirely, and extending from the front of that mask, curving downward like the beak of a very large, very deliberate bird. A hollow cone of leather, perhaps 6 inches long, stuffed at the tip with something aromatic. You can smell it from here, or you think you can, the sharp top, note of rosemary cutting through the other smells of the street, which are considerable. The figure is carrying a cane. The cane is perhaps 4 feet long. The figure uses it to examine without touching. This is the point of the cane. The figure has thought carefully about the distance between itself and what it is walking toward. You step to the side of the street. So does everyone else. The plague doctor costume, the full ensemble that the historical imagination has preserved most faithfully from the medieval and early modern period, was not the original medieval response to epidemic disease. It was a refinement, a considered, professionally motivated refinement, developed as the plague returned in successive waves through the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, and as the cities that survived long enough to develop institutional responses began to think systematically about the people they were sending into the houses of the dying. The costume as it is most commonly described, the beaked mask, the waxed coat, the hat, the gloves, the cane, the glass eye covers, was formalized in its most complete form in the 17th century, associated with the French physician Charles de Vallorme, who designed or codified the full ensemble for use during plague outbreaks in France around 1619. The earlier medieval plague response was less systematized, more improvised, and considerably less photogenic, though no less earnest in its attempt to stand between the physician and the disease. The underlying theory was miasma, bad air malaria, from which malaria eventually derives its name, was the presumed mechanism of plague transmission. The disease moved through the air as corruption, as poisoned exhalation, as the concentrated emanation of rotting matter and sinful accumulation. You contracted it by breathing the wrong air, by being near enough to the wrong person or the wrong place that the miasma entered your lungs and began its work. This was wrong. The plague was bacterial, Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by flea bite, secondarily by respiratory droplet in its pneumonic form, and the miasma theory missed the mechanism entirely. But the miasma theory was not stupid. It was observational. People noticed that plague clustered in dense, low-lying, poorly ventilated areas. People noticed that it moved along trade routes, along rivers, through ports. People noticed that some of the worst outbreaks coincided with particularly hot, wet summers, when the smells of the city intensified and the rotting matter in the streets became more aggressively present. All of these observations were correct. The conclusions drawn from them were wrong. But the observations were correct, and wrong conclusions drawn from correct observations are not the same as superstition. They are the best available inference from the available data, and the available data was genuinely pointing at something real, just not at the flea. The beak was the implementation of the miasma theory. If disease entered through bad air, then the air you breathed needed to be good air filtered through something aromatic, something that smelled of health and dryness and the opposite of rot. The beak was stuffed with dried flowers, aromatic herbs, straw, sometimes a vinegar, soaked sponge. Rosemary was common. Lavender, camphor, ambergris in the wealthier preparations. The physician breathed through the beak, and the beak filtered the air through its aromatic contents. And the filtered air, in theory, within the miasma framework, was safe to breathe. It was not safe. The beak did not filter bacteria. The beak did not address the flea. The plague doctor, walking through the house of a dying patient, was not protected by the beak from Yersinia pestis. He was protected partially by the waxed canvas coat, which fleas found more difficult to grip than wool. He was protected partially by the gloves for the same reason. He was not protected at all by the beak, which was doing exactly what it was designed to do and nothing that the disease required it to do. The plague doctors died, not all of them, not at the same rate as the general population, because the waxed canvas and the gloves and the general policy of not touching patients directly with bare hands did provide some protection from primary transmission vector, even if the miasma theory got the mechanism wrong. But they died. The cities that hired plague doctors were hiring people who accepted, as a professional condition, a mortality risk that their contract specified in some cases and left implicit in others. The costume had one element that was not in the original design, added later as a refinement, not as a founding feature. That element is the one part of the ensemble that provided genuine barrier protection against something the disease actually used. We will come back to it first, what the plague doctor actually did inside the house, which was less than the costume suggests and more than nothing. The plague doctor's role was not treatment. This is the first clarification the sources insist on, once you read them carefully. The plague doctor was a municipal employee. In the cities organized enough to hire one, paid a salary by the city government, contracted to serve for the duration of the outbreak, given certain protections and certain obligations that varied by city and by contract, but shared a common core. He recorded. He assessed. He reported. He walked into the house of the reported sick, examined the patient from the distance the cane provided, pressing the cane against the body to check for the swollen lymph nodes in the groin, an armpit that characterized bubonic plague, using it to lift the clothing and examine the skin for the blackened patches of subcutaneous hemorrhage that gave the disease one of its common names, using it to move the patient's limbs without direct contact, and made a determination, yes or no, plague or not plague. And if plague, what stage? The stage mattered for the city's record keeping. It mattered for the quarantine determination, whether the household would be sealed, for how long, under whose authority. It mattered for the death record, which the plague doctor was also responsible for maintaining, the careful ledger of names and dates and neighborhoods that the surviving municipalities kept because knowing the shape of the outbreak was the only tool available for managing it. He also, in some contracts, attempted treatment. The treatments available were the treatments available, the herbal preparations of the monastery tradition, the bloodletting that humoral medicine prescribed for almost everything, the lancing of buboes that some physicians recommended and others feared would accelerate the spread of whatever the bubo contained, the dietary restrictions and the rest and the prayer that were the baseline interventions of a medical tradition confronting something it did not have the conceptual framework to understand. The lancing of buboes is a detail worth pausing on. A bubo, the swollen lymph node packed with Yersinia pestis, is, if lanced and drained under conditions that prevent the contents from being dispersed into the air or onto unprotected skin, not necessarily fatal to the patient. Some patients who survived the plague survived because a physician or a barber-surgeon lanced the bubo at the right moment, relieving the pressure, allowing the immune system room to do what immune systems occasionally do against bacterial infection, even without antibiotics. The survival was not understood. The mechanism was not understood. But the observation that some patients who were lanced survived, that some who were not lanced did not, existed in the literature imprecisely, alongside observations that contradicted it, and physicians made the decision each time with the information they had, which was never sufficient and sometimes enough. The fee was negotiated before the physician entered the house. This appears in enough sources across enough cities to constitute standard practice rather than individual variation. The dying patient, or more often the dying patient's family, agreed to a sum before the plague doctor crossed the threshold. The sum varied enormously by city, by year, by the desperation of the family, by the reputation of the specific physician, by how many other physicians were still alive and willing to enter houses. That year, in some cities, the municipal contract paid the physician directly, removing the bedside negotiation from the equation. In other cities, the physician collected from the family and remitted a portion to the city. In some documented cases, the physician collected from the family and remitted nothing, because the city's administrative apparatus had itself been significantly reduced by the circumstances. The cane, in some accounts, served a secondary purpose that the primary sources mention without elaboration. It kept the family at a distance. A household in crisis, with a dying member and no other physician willing to come, was a household with strong incentives to get physically close to the one physician who had come. Cain maintained a perimeter. The plague doctor examined the patient. He did not embrace the family. He did not take the hand of the wife who met him at the door. He stood at Cain's length and delivered his assessment and his fee arrangement and his best available intervention, and then he left, and the door closed behind him, and he walked back through the quiet street to the next address on his list, the element added later, the glass eye covers. The original plague doctor descriptions, the earlier iterations, before Duhalorme's systematization, mention the mask, the coat, the hat, the gloves. The glass lenses fitted into the eye openings of the mask appear in the later, more complete descriptions. They were added as the costume evolved, as physicians who wore earlier versions noticed what was happening to their eyes in the houses of the sick. The irritation, the inflammation, the specific vulnerability of a mucous membrane left unprotected in an environment of aerosolized material and flea activity. The glass lenses provided genuine barrier protection. Not from the primary transmission route, not from the flea, not from the bacterial aerosol of pneumonic plague, but from the direct inoculation of infectious material into the eye's mucous membrane, which is a real transmission risk that the later plague doctors had observed correctly and addressed correctly with a piece of ground glass fitted into a leather mask. They did not know why it helped. They knew that it did. They had been in enough houses, with and without the glass, and the glass was better. The observation was correct. The mechanism that the eye's mucous membrane is a viable entry point for certain pathogens, that barrier protection of that membrane reduces transmission risk, is modern knowledge worn casually by the physicians who reached it first through the slow accumulation of watching what happened when you did and did not cover the eyes. It was not science in the formal sense. It was observation, careful and repeated and expensive in its day, a collection. It was the only kind of science available, and it produced, in this case, the right answer. The beak was wrong. The glass was right. The costume contained both, which is an accurate portrait of medieval medicine, generally wrong and right occupying the same frame, indistinguishable from each other without the knowledge that comes after the plague doctors managed the dying. They walked into the quiet and counted the names and lanced the buboes and collected the fees and left. And the quiet continued, and the names accumulated. But before a medieval person reached the quiet street and the figure with the beak, before they became a name in the plague doctor's ledger, they had already been through a different system of care, a more intimate one. A system organized not around disease but around beginning, around the moment the medieval body first arrived in the world, in a room that had its own rules, its own exclusions, its own specifics, and practiced response to what happened when the arrival went wrong. The lying in room had one rule above all others. The rule was enforced more strictly than anything else in that room, and breaking it, even by accident, carried consequences that followed a household for years. We will get to the rule, and to the one recorded case of a man who broke it, and to what happened to him afterward, which was not brief, and was not gentle, and was entirely predictable to everyone in the neighborhood, except, apparently, to him. Welcome to the lying in room. You are not allowed in here. This is not a suggestion. This is not a social preference that flexible circumstances might soften. This is a rule with the weight of custom and canon, and the accumulated opinion of every woman in the neighborhood behind it. And the neighborhood's opinion in a medieval town was a force with consequences more immediate than most legal instruments. The door is closed. It will remain closed. What happens behind it is not your business, and the fact that it is very much your business in every other sense, that you have a direct and permanent interest in the outcome, that the person behind the door is known to you, that you have been awake since before dawn in the room directly below this one. None of that changes the rule. The rule is no men, not the husband, not the physician, not the priest, unless the situation has deteriorated to the point where the priest's specific function has become relevant. And if you are sending for the priest, you are no longer sending for him to bless the occasion. The room belongs to the midwife and to the women she has called, the neighbors, the female relatives, the experienced mothers who have been in this room before in the capacity you are in it now, who know what the sounds mean and what they do not mean, and when to send the boy running for the midwife's second bag, and when to simply wait. You wait, the fire is burning in the room above you. You can hear it, the particular sound of a fire kept higher than a fire needs to be kept, fed through the night and into the morning regardless of the season, because the lying in room was sealed, and heated and kept from the outside air with a thoroughness that reflected a theory of vulnerability that was wrong in its mechanism and not entirely wrong in its instinct. The newborn was fragile, the mother was fragile, the outside air was full of things that harmed fragile things. The room would be warm, the windows would be covered, the world outside would wait. You wait with it. The lying in room was a specifically female space in a world that had few specifically female spaces. Medieval domestic architecture did not generally allocate rooms by gender. The household moved through the available space according to function and season and the needs of the day. The lying in room was the exception. For the duration of labor, delivery, and the lying, in period that followed, which could extend to several weeks, depending on the household's means and the mother's recovery, the room was governed by women's knowledge and women's authority, and the governance was taken seriously. The midwife was the central figure, not a physician, not a monk, not a barber-surgeon, despite the barber-surgeon's willingness to address most other medical situations that presented themselves. The midwife was a specialist, trained through apprenticeship rather than text. Her knowledge accumulated through attendance at births over years and decades. Her reputation established through outcomes that the neighborhood tracked with the careful attention of people who had a collective interest in the competence of the person, likely to be present at their own delivery. She arrived with a bag. The bag contained specific preparations, herbal compounds for pain management, for stimulating labor that had stalled, for managing bleeding, for the cord and the afterbirth, and the various contingencies that experience had taught her to anticipate. Ergot preparations from the fungus that grew on rye grain were used to stimulate uterine contractions, which works and also causes vasoconstriction and neurological effects at higher doses, which is why ergot is also the compound from which LSD is structurally derived. The midwife using ergot preparations was using something genuinely pharmacologically active, in doses estimated by experience rather than measured by any instrument, in a patient whose response varied by body weight and overall condition, and the specific alkaloid concentration of the particular batch of ergot. She was doing the best available medicine. The best available medicine was imprecise. It was better than nothing, and better than nothing was the available standard. The laboring woman was positioned on a birthing stool, a chair with a curved opening in the seat, allowing the midwife to work while the mother remained partially upright, which modern obstetrics has found to be genuinely advantageous for the mechanics of delivery. The birthing stool appears in medieval illustrations, in midwifery texts, in the household inventories of families wealthy enough to own one rather than borrowing the midwife's. It was not a primitive approximation of something better. It was a piece of equipment that had been refined through centuries of empirical use, and had arrived at a form that worked. The floor beneath the stool was covered with rushes or clean straw. The women attending stood in the places the midwife assigned them, one at the mother's back, supporting, one on each side, the midwife herself in front, watching, waiting, ready to act when action was required, and to wait when waiting was required, and knowing the difference, which was the skill that separated a good midwife from a bad one, and a living mother from a dead one. The room smelled of the fire and of the herbs burning in it. Rosemary was common, for its associations with purification and strength, and of the specific human smells of effort and fear, and animal work that the body does when it is doing the hardest thing it does. The windows were covered. The door was closed. The lying-in room had one rule above all the others. It was not about cleanliness, though cleanliness mattered. It was not about quiet, though the midwife managed noise. It was not about any of the practical logistics of delivery, position, timing, the sequence of interventions the midwife had prepared. The rule was about the door, and who could not come through it. And the enforcement of that prohibition was the most serious social business the neighborhood conducted outside of a funeral or a trial. No men. The prohibition was absolute. And there is one recorded case documented in enough detail to reconstruct the sequence of a husband who crossed it, and what followed, which was neither quick nor merciful, and was understood by everyone in the neighborhood as entirely appropriate. We will get to him. The outcomes of medieval childbirth were what they were. Approximately 1 in 40 deliveries resulted in the death of the mother, a rate that sounds manageable stated as a fraction, and sounds different stated as what it was, which was the most common cause of death for women between the ages of 15 and 45 in the medieval period, which was the age range in which most medieval women delivered children, which was most medieval women. 1 in 40 per delivery, multiple deliveries over a lifetime. The mathematics, accumulated, were not comfortable. The midwife knew the mathematics. The attending women knew the mathematics. The laboring woman knew the mathematics. In the way you know a thing you have decided not to think about directly, because thinking about it directly serves no function during labor. You thought about it before. You had made certain arrangements before. The priest had been spoken to. The will, if there was a will, had been reviewed. The children currently living in the household had been accounted for. These were not morbid preparations. They were practical ones, made by practical people who understood what rooms like this one sometimes required. The child's mathematics were different, and in some ways worse. Stillbirth, neonatal death in the first days, the range of conditions that a newborn could arrive with, and that medieval medicine had no mechanism to address. These were present in the lying-in room as a kind of ambient awareness, not spoken about directly, managed through the specific activity of doing everything correctly, and hoping that doing everything correctly was sufficient. The baptism was the emergency protocol. A child born alive but failing, blue, small, not breathing correctly, not responding in the ways the midwife recognized as good signs, received baptism immediately, in the room, administered by the midwife. This was explicitly permitted by church canon, specifically because the alternative was an unbaptized death, which carried theological consequences that the medieval church took seriously and that medieval families took more seriously still. The midwife kept water for this purpose. The words she spoke were the correct words, and she had been taught them specifically, and she used them when she needed to with the practiced efficiency of someone for whom this was not the first time and would not be the last. The ritual mattered. The ritual was also the acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. The room held both of those things at once, which was what the room was for, holding the things that had to be held while the work continued. What happened when the child was not positioned correctly is the part that the surviving texts address with a clinical specificity that reads, at this distance, as a kind of professional courage. The midwife had tools for malposition.
She had knowledge of version, the manual rotation of a wrongly positioned infant, performed by careful manipulation from outside the body, a technique that requires both skill and a tolerance.
The feedback the procedure provides.
She had, in cases where version failed, a set of instruments that the texts describe in terms chosen carefully for their neutrality, because what the instruments were used for was the decision that
nobody in the room wanted to make, and that was sometimes the only decision available. The calculation, save the mother or the child, was not a calculation the modern medical world is asked to make in the same terms, because the modern medical world has options the lying. In room did not have the medieval midwife made it. She made it according to a framework that consistently prioritized the mother's life, which was the framework her training and her community had given her, which was also the practical calculus of world where the living children in the household needed their mother more than the household could absorb another loss. The husband who crossed the threshold. Here is what the record shows. In a case documented in the records of a French ecclesiastical court in the late medieval period, the specific date and location are debated among historians who have worked with the manuscript, but the account itself is considered genuine. A man entered the lying in room during his wife's labor. The reason given in the account is anxiety. He had been waiting below. He had heard sounds that alarmed him. He opened the door. The midwife stopped what she was doing. The attending women turned. The account, filtered through the ecclesiastical record, does not describe what happened in that room in the next several minutes in physical terms. What it describes is the sequence of events that followed. The midwife reported the intrusion to the parish priest. The parish priest recorded it. The matter was taken to the local ecclesiastical authority because violations of the lying in room's prohibition fell within the church's purview over the moral governance of household life. The husband was brought before the authority. He explained his anxiety. The explanation was received without evident sympathy. The church's position was that the sanctity of the lying in room was not a custom but a protection for the mother, for the child, for the attending women, and for the households standing in the community. The penance was substantial. The account does not specify the exact nature, because ecclesiastical penances were often administered privately and recorded only in summary, but the language used, the Latin, is specific in a way that suggests the authority was not extending particular leniency, indicates a period of public acknowledgement and a period of restriction from certain communal activities that constituted, in practical terms, a temporary reduction in the man's social standing and civic function. The wife recovered. The child survived. The midwife had not paused long enough for the interruption to affect the outcome. The husband did not enter that room again. The rule was not arbitrary. Rules that survive for centuries in stable communities are rarely arbitrary. The lying in room was the one space in the medieval household where female knowledge was not subject to male correction, where the midwife's authority was not subordinate to the physician's, where the work was done by the people who knew how to do it, in the way they had always done it, without consultation. The prohibition on men was the enforcement mechanism for that authority. It was also, almost certainly, a genuine protection. The fewer people in the room, the fewer vectors of contamination, the simpler the management of a situation that was already managing at the limit of what available knowledge could handle. Disease wasn't tragedy in the lying in room. It was a risk you managed or you didn't, and the management was the midwife's, and the midwife's authority was the room's one inviolable rule, and the husband below who had been awake since before dawn was simply going to have to wait. He waited. A child born in the medieval period entered a world that had very specific ideas about what the body was, what it owed, and what happened to it when it finally gave out. The last stop in the medieval body's journey was not the lying in room, and not the plague doctor's ledger. It was something older and stranger, and, in its own way, more organized than either. The medieval dead were managed with the same practical seriousness the medieval living were managed with. They were washed and bound and placed and accounted for, and the accounting was kept by people who had rates and records, and, according to documents that survive from several European cities, a market that operated with the brisk efficiency of any other medieval trade. The bones went somewhere. They went somewhere specific, and the somewhere specific is, by any modern measure, the strangest destination in this entire account. Welcome to the parish burial ground. It is smaller than you expected.
Everything in the medieval town is smaller than a modern person expects. The streets, the rooms, the gaps between buildings where the light comes through at angles that suggest the builders were
not overly concerned with the concept of personal space. The burial ground is no exception. It sits beside the church, which sits at the center of the town, which means the dead are at the center of the town, which the living find entirely natural because the dead have always been at the center of the town, and the living have organized themselves around that fact for as long as there has been a town to organize. The ground has been used for a long time. This is visible if you know how to look. The surface is not flat. It rises and falls in a way that is not geological, not drainage, not the ordinary variation of ground that has been walked on and rained on for a century. It is the variation of ground that has been filled and refilled, that has settled over what it contains and been filled again, that has received more than its dimensions would suggest it could receive, and has, through the patient geometry of vertical space, received it anyway. The mathematics of a medieval parish burial ground are straightforward and quietly astonishing. A ground of modest size, serving a town of several hundred people, across several centuries of continuous use. The numbers do not work unless the ground is used in layers. The old making room for the new. The bones of the longer dead moved, when necessary, to make room for the recently dead, who will in their turn be moved when they are sufficiently old to be relocated without ceremony. The ceremony, in medieval Christian burial practice, attached to the moment of interment. What happened afterward was practical. The preparation of the body began immediately after death. Immediately, because in a pre-refrigeration world, the body's own chemistry began its particular work within hours, and the work it did was incompatible with the social requirements of the preparation and the wake, and the funeral mass that followed. Speed was courtesy. Speed was also necessity. The body was washed. This was women's work, in most of the documented traditions, the same women's network that had managed the lying. In room now managed its terminal counterpart, the washing of the body, a ritual that moved in reverse along the same lines of female knowledge and female authority that governed birth. The washing was thorough. It was performed with water that had been prepared, sometimes with herbs, sometimes with wine, sometimes simply clean water in a household that could not afford the herbs or the wine. The body was washed from head to foot, the limbs straightened, the jaw bound closed with a strip of linen that would remain until the rigor had done its work, and the jaw would hold its position without assistance. The hands were folded. The feet were bound together lightly, a token binding, sufficient to maintain the position during the laying out, and the wake, rather than any serious restraint. The eyes, if they had not closed at the moment of death, were closed now. A coin was sometimes placed over each eye, a practice with roots old enough that its Christian period continuation was essentially cultural inertia, the gesture surviving the theology that had originally motivated it. Herbs were packed into the cavities, not symbolically, practically. The smell of a body in a warm room over 24 hours of waking was a smell that required management, and the management was herbal, using what the household had or what the neighborhood could quickly supply: lavender, rosemary. In wealthier households, more expensive preparations, spices imported at considerable cost. The expense itself a statement about what the dead person had been worth, and what the living person, making the arrangement, wished to signal about that worth. The shroud was linen, almost always linen.
The wealthiest dead received burial in clothing, the full dress of their station, the hood, the gown, the belt, the shoes, but this was expensive, and the church periodically expressed reservations about the waste of good clothing on the dead, and in practice most people went into the ground in linen.
The linen was wrapped and pinned and was the last layer between the person and the earth, which received it with the patient indifference of earth that has received a great many things and has opinions about none of them. There is one profession in medieval Europe whose entire job was the movement of dead saints from one location to another. They had a guild, they had established rates. They had, according to documents that survive from several cities, a secondary market that operated with a commercial efficiency that the church officially condemned and practically depended on. We will get to the rates, and to the market, and to the particular economic logic of a world in which a dead man's finger could be worth more than a living man's annual income. The burial itself was tiered. This is the word the records use, not the modern sense of tier as rank, but the literal sense of layers, levels, the vertical organization of a space that was always running short of horizontal. Room, a full church burial, inside the church building, beneath the flagstones of the nave or the chancel, in a location that reflected the dead person standing, was the premium option. The cost was substantial. A laborer in a mid-sized English town in the 14th century, earning perhaps 2 pence a day, would need to work for months to afford a full interior burial for a family member. The wealthy were buried inside. Their monuments were carved in stone. Their names were preserved in the chantry endowments they funded before death. Masses said for their souls on a schedule by priests paid specifically for this purpose. The spiritual accounting of the medieval afterlife expressed in commercial terms that the participants found entirely natural. Outside, in the churchyard proper, the burial was less expensive and less permanent. A marked grave, a wooden cross, occasionally a stone for those who could afford the marker, an unmarked grave for those who could not. The distinction between marked and unmarked was a distinction between memory and forgetting, between a name that persisted into the next generation and a name that did not, between a family that could visit a specific location and a family that knew approximately the direction. After a generation, sometimes less, depending on the pressure on the ground, the unmarked graves were open. The bones were removed. They were taken to the charnel house. The charnel house was not a secret. It was not hidden, not shameful, not the kind of thing that medieval people discussed in lowered voices. It was infrastructure, the same way the Foraca was infrastructure, the same way the Barber-Surgeon's cane was infrastructure, a practical solution to a practical problem, existing because the problem existed and required solving. The charnel house received the older bones, stacked them, organized them with varying degrees of system depending on the resources and the temperament of whoever was responsible for organization, and made room in the ground above for the next occupant. Some charnel houses were open to visitors, not in the way a museum is open to visitors, in the way a part of the town is open, accessible, present in daily life. The Cemetery of the Innocents in Paris, the largest medieval burial ground in the city, in continuous use for 10 centuries, receiving the bodies of the poor from the surrounding parishes in numbers that eventually reached 2 million, had market stalls between the arcades that lined the walls. Bakers, cloth merchants, scribes available to write letters for the illiterate. The bones of the older dead stacked in the arched niches behind the stalls. Commerce and mortality organized into the same physical space, operating simultaneously, neither one impeding the other. You bought bread there. You had your letter written there. You did not flinch at what was behind the baker's stall, because it had always been there, and it was the bread you needed, and the letter was urgent. Death wasn't dramatic. It was behind the bread stall. And here is the part that requires a specific vocabulary the modern world has mostly lost. The medieval dead were not equal in their death. This is obvious: the interior burial versus the churchyard, the stone monument versus the wooden cross, but the inequality extended further than location and marker. The medieval dead were divisible. Specifically, certain medieval dead, the saints, the blessed, the formally canonized, and the informally venerated, were divisible in a literal, physical, commercially significant sense that Church simultaneously regulated, relied upon, and could not entirely control. A saint's body was a relic. The body's parts were relics. Each part authenticated, documented, transferred with appropriate ceremony, was an object of veneration with genuine spiritual potency in the medieval framework, and with genuine economic value. In any framework, a saint's finger, housed in a jeweled reliquary, drew pilgrims. Pilgrims spent money. The church that housed the relic received donations, accommodation fees, the economic activity of a population traveling specifically to stand near the object and offer what they could afford. The demand for relics was real. The supply was limited. The mathematics of that situation were the same mathematics they always are. The translation of relics, the formal transfer of a saint's remains from one location to another, was a church, regulated process requiring episcopal or papal approval, conducted with ceremony, documented in records that were meant to establish the authenticity of the relic and the legitimacy of the transfer. A relic with a documented translation history was worth more than a relic without one. The documentation was the authentication. The authentication was the value. The translation trade had specialists, men whose professional function was the movement of saints' remains, negotiating the transfer, managing the documentation, transporting the object safely, delivering it to the purchasing institution with the paperwork that made it legitimate. They had rates. The rates varied by the saint's prominence, by the completeness of the remains, by the distance of transfer, by the quality of the existing documentation. They also had, the surviving records suggest, a secondary market. The secondary market was in relics of uncertain provenance, saints' bones without complete documentation, fragments of uncertain origin, objects claimed to be contact relics that had touched the body of a known saint. The Church condemned this market. The Church's condemnation was genuine and was also partially ineffective, because the demand that drove the primary market drove the secondary market with equal force and the institutional capacity. To verify every relic in every church in every diocese of medieval Europe was not a capacity the medieval church possessed. The result was a relic supply that exceeded the possible supply of actual saints, remains by a margin that some medieval commentators noted with carefully worded concern, and that the Reformation commentators addressed less carefully. The number of documented fragments of the true cross, calculated in the 16th century by Calvin, among others, would have required a tree of implausible dimensions. The number of saints' skulls in European churches exceeded the number of saints for whom skulls were claimed. These observations were not made to mock. They were made to address a market that had outgrown its supply and had responded the way markets respond when demand exceeds supply and verification is difficult. The bones continued to move, the rates continued to apply, the documentation continued to be produced with varying degrees of relationship to the bodies it documented. The dead saints continued to generate economic activity they had not anticipated and could not audit. The living, meanwhile, organized their towns around the dead, the burial ground at the center, the charnel house at the edge, the relic in the reliquary at the altar, the bread stall in the arcade, with the bones behind it. They moved through all of it without flinching, because you do not flinch at the ordinary, and all of this was ordinary, and the ordinary was what life was made of when you were not busy dying. The bones went into the wall became the church became the town square, and somewhere beneath the cobblestones the medieval dead are still perfectly organized. They always were. If you're still watching That means you made it all the way through the ancient Rome with me. So thank you for staying. And if you didn't, that's kind of perfect, because these stories were never meant to be rushed. They're meant to linger slowly in the background until your mind lets go. So whether you're still here or already asleep, I'll see you in the next one.